Hello, and welcome to HTTP's Digital Inclusion Summit. My name is Judan Heath, and I am the new National Programs Director for HTTP. 2022 is an important milestone towards our shared goal of achieving universal broadband access and offers the possibility of a digital breakthrough for historically unserved and underserved communities. Tech and telecommunications policy is the new frontier for civil rights, and today's program hopes to elevate multicultural voices with the goal of providing strategies, support, and insight to those policymakers, the federal government, private industry, and local communities nationwide, and how we are working together to achieve an inclusive and equitable tech future that benefits everyone. We invite you to join the conversation today on Twitter and on Instagram using the hashtag Digital Breakthrough, and by following HTTP on both platforms at HTTP_policy. If you are on Instagram, we also have some awesome stickers. To use these stickers everywhere, first make sure that you have downloaded the Giphy app on your phone. Giphy is an integrated app and powers all of the GIFs on Facebook, your iPhone, and on Instagram. So if you don't already have it downloaded, go to the App Store, search for Giphy, and click download. Let me show you how to make these all work. On Instagram, start a story like you normally would. Click on the top kind of square smiley face, which will pull up the menu of options. Then select the GIF button and then type in HTTP:/digital, and you will see all the stickers available. Please feel free to spread the word and add them to your stories. And remember to tag us at HTTP_policy. And we want to hear from you. Your voice is just as important as the voices featured in today's program. So please tweet, retweet, share, tell us your stories, ask us your questions, and remember to tag at HTTP_policy. I will also be joining our Latino influencers live throughout the program and reposting some of our favorites. See you all online. It is now my pleasure to welcome HTTP Board Chair Brent Wilkes. I've had the opportunity to work with Brent in various capacities over the years, and I am so excited to get another opportunity to collaborate again here at HTTP. Thank you for joining us, Brent.
Thanks, Judan, and thank you all for joining us for HTTP's Digital Inclusion Summit. With the uncertainty that we all experienced the past few years, we are back to being virtual, but we look forward to hosting you all in person next year for a live event. 2022 has already been a year of tremendous growth and renewal for HTTP, and this is something that's no exception for many of you. Alejandro, who many of us know, and who started the Digital Inclusion Summit for HTTP, has left us to join the Federal Communications Commission. We're so proud of him for really making a huge difference over at the Federal Communications Commission. But that has opened the door for the expansion of our HTTP team. And so this year, we are happy to welcome Judan Heath as HTTP's National Programs Director, Dario Pantosin, who will lead our communication strategy. And we've also brought on Chris Rodriguez as our first National Policy Fellow. You will hear more from Chris and Judan throughout the program today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank this year's underwriting partners, Comcast, NBC Universal Telemundo, Verizon, AT&T, Google, T-Mobile, Charter, and Meta. Thank you all so much for your incredible support of HTTP. And thank you for your ongoing partnership and support of this year's program. In addition to chairing HTTP, I have the privilege of serving as the Senior Vice President for Institutional Development for Hispanic Federation. And Hispanic Federation is also investing heavily in promoting Latino digital inclusion. For example, our Latino Digital Accelerator program helps build the digital skills training capacity of Latino-led and Latino-serving nonprofits engaged in workforce development. And through them, we're helping to increase Latino community access to digital skills training. The initiative combines organizational capacity building, support for digital career centers, housed in more than 40 partner nonprofits, and a long-term online Latino Digital Center of Excellence to share knowledge and resources through research, curriculum development, and access, and disseminations of lessons learned. Over 12,000 individuals have been trained through the Latino Digital Accelerator Network in just its first year of operation, and many of those individuals have been able to get new job opportunities, and in some cases have even tripled their salaries. So we know this works. It's now my great pleasure to be able to introduce Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, whose historic election came after a lifetime of public service, having been elected the District Attorney of San Francisco, the California Attorney General, and United States Senator. With her help, the bipartisan infrastructure package recently passed and has brought the largest investment in history to work toward bridging the digital divide, something that's at the very core of what HTTP does. At the heart of the White House strategy, led by the Vice President, is ensuring the access of high-speed internet to everyone and everywhere. The White House has been doing an amazing job with the Vice President's help of conducting virtual listening sessions on the digital divide and getting the community's input on how to address this important topic. The administration is also focused on creating a high-speed rural internet initiative as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law that the Vice President helped negotiate and get passed. The whole government approach to connecting everyone everywhere is really making a huge difference. And the Vice President has been front and center of making this opportunity a reality. So please help me welcome the Vice President of the United States.
Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to join you today. In the 21st century, high-speed internet is a necessity. Students use it to access digital textbooks. Parents use the internet to get their weekly shopping done, and entrepreneurs use the internet to start and grow small businesses. People everywhere use the internet to read the news, to check the weather, to plan their trips, and so much more. And for so many of us, the internet is essential to taking care of the stuff we need to handle every day. Yet, today, more than 42 million people in our country do not have access to high-speed internet at home. Some because they cannot afford the cost of a monthly plan, and others because high-speed internet is just not available in the place where they live. And we know that for certain communities, they are much less likely to be connected to the internet than others for both those reasons, accessibility and affordability. In fact, less than 65% of Hispanic adults have high-speed internet access at home. And this has real consequences. When people are cut off from high-speed internet, they are cut off from opportunity. The opportunity to pursue an education or to receive health care and to build a business. And that is why our administration is working to ensure that every person in our nation, no matter where they live or how much they earn, can access and afford high-speed internet. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, our administration invested $65 billion to expand and modernize our broadband infrastructure and to lower the cost of high-speed internet. HTTP is essential to the success of all of that work. Every day, you, as leaders, are building bridges across the digital divide. You are helping connect the people of our nation with the technology and the opportunities they need to succeed and to thrive. I thank you all and each of you for your leadership and for your partnership. Take care.
Thank you again, Vice President Harris, for your leadership and for taking the time to be with us today. As mentioned this year, this moment is our opportunity to achieve a digital breakthrough for everyone. For those of you unfamiliar with the work of HTTP, we are a CEO roundtable of national Latino civil rights organizations taking collective action to promote access, adoption, and the full utilization of technology and telecommunications resources by the Latinx community across the United States. Through our community education, advocacy, and by serving as a collective national voice for underserved communities in the tech and telecommunications policy arena, we hope to achieve a fair, just, and equitable digital economy together, one where every person can connect, create, and thrive. The dual health and economic crisis that all of us are currently still surviving underscored that the digital divide is not just a divide, but for Latinx, Black, Indigenous, Asian folks, and other communities of color, it is more like a cliff that separates us into digital haves and digital have-nots. There is good news. With the help of President Biden and Vice President Harris and the bipartisan infrastructure package, we do have the tools to help ensure that every person, regardless of where they live or their economic standing, can have access to affordable, reliable broadband internet. This, paired with increased access to digital devices and digital skills training, helps give communities a better foundation to make full use of the resources available online for education, work, telehealth, and more. Most importantly, we are having the necessary conversations about digital equity and what it will take to actually achieve our shared goal of universal access and adoption. I'm so excited to start today's panel with 4 dynamic women leading at the local and national level to help us define these building blocks of digital equity. This conversation is presented in partnership with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance and is led by NDIA's Executive Director, Angela Seifer. Angela, thank you and take it away.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, in my home office, and that's my dog sleeping. I don't know, can you see her? She's adorable. It's great to be here. We're thrilled to be doing this panel. I'm thrilled to have 3 of my favorite people, 3 female rock stars in the digital inclusion space, talking about what it is that they are doing in their communities in very collaborative ways, all of them, which is super awesome. And they're all from different fields, which is even more perfect. So real quick, NDIA, we've been around about 7 years. It's National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Our website is digitalinclusion.org. We got started because there wasn't an entity on the ground representing local digital inclusion programs like what you're going to hear from these lovely ladies. So our job is to elevate what they're doing, learn from them and all the others who are doing work like them, and then take that and help folks who are doing similar work talk to each other, learn from each other, but then also take it to policymakers so they understand what that expertise is locally. So let's get started. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, just a tiny bit about their work, and then we're just going to have a lively, fun conversation. Jordan, would you like to go first?
Happy to. Thanks, Angela, for having me. My name is Jordan Davis. I'm also in Columbus, Ohio. I am the executive director of an organization called Smart Columbus, which is the community's innovation office. And we chair the Digital Equity Coalition here in Franklin County. And we're a collaborative coalition of over 30 different nonprofit organizations, looking at everything from expanding broadband access to device access, skills, and outreach overall. Excited to be with you today.
And Carrie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Angela. And I'm Carrie Coogan, and I'm the Deputy Director for Community Engagement and Public Affairs at the Kansas City Public Library in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm also part of the steering council of the Kansas City Coalition for Digital Inclusion. I've been doing this work for 8-10 years or more now. I'm really excited about it. We were lucky enough to host one of the very first National Digital Inclusion Alliance conferences in Kansas City, Missouri, way back when. But really just so thrilled to be here and share information and ideas, because now with the pandemic and everything that it's revealed about the digital divide, it's just such an important time for us to share and collaborate and find ways to make sure that everybody can be connected, as quickly, as efficiently, as equitably, and, and do this in the most fair and transparent way that we can. So really happy to be here and excited to meet with this incredible group of people.
Thank you, Carrie. Candelaria.
Hi, Yeah, Candelaria Mendoza. I am the interim digital inclusion administrator at the city of San Antonio. And I've been working with digital inclusion and helping kind of lead the conversations, socializing digital vibe for last few years, definitely in collaboration with all the amazing entities that are already doing digital inclusion work and advocacy in San Antonio. So I definitely see my role as that, a kind of a connector piece, trying to get an idea about the big picture so that we can really focus on any gaps, and really leveraging this kind of once in a lifetime opportunity with this infrastructure bill to do as much as we possibly can to move the needle on the digital divide, and then obviously advocate for pieces that may be missing. So I'm excited to share that information with y'all, a little bit about our lessons learned. Hopefully we can kind of connect and get to what Carrie mentioned, which is those best practices, so we can all be a little bit more effective in this space.
Super, thank you. So digital inclusion is the activities that get us to digital equity. One of the first things NDIA did was develop these definitions, and digital equity is for everyone, individuals, communities having full access and use of information communication technologies. Digital inclusion being the how. So digital inclusion, those how is what everyone here works on every day. That is the access to the network itself that's affordable, the devices that meet somebody's needs, the digital literacy training, the tech support. In that how, what we've seen really just blossom during the pandemic is this need for collaboration and the development of coalitions. So all three of our panelists today run in some way, either in a big way or a smaller way, are involved with coalitions and collaborative work in their communities. So let's get into the differences between the work of a coalition versus the work of your organizations, because your organizations themselves do digital inclusion work. That's not the same as the coalition doing this work. I know Jordan and I, since we're in the same town, have actually had to have beverages over this exact topic. So I'm going to ask Jordan to get started and how she and some of her collaborators in Columbus see this issue.
Yeah, it's one of our biggest tensions is the dynamic between coordination and communication and implementation, and where is the line, and when do you kind of give the responsibility to the local organizations to really run with and make sure that the coalition doesn't overstep its role creating priorities or unintended competition with organizations within the own group. So my other hat is executive director of Smart Columbus. We are an innovation collaborative, and we're doing a lot of implementation work in facilitating pilots and proofs of concept. We're doing research and really kind of laying the groundwork of discovery for new projects and interventions that will help close these divides. The difference of the DEC really is in helping to identify those, and I think bring a level of coordination and transparency to what all is going on. So if we can get it all on the table, that helps others figure out where there's space to add a solution, or there's space to grow an existing solution, or, hey, we need to coordinate and cross kind of pollinate this opportunity. I think it's a work in progress. I don't think it's an art more than a science. But it takes a lot of really a willingness to have some really difficult conversations to make sure we're all playing the right roles in the ecosystem.
Candelaria, can you describe what's happening in San Antonio, the role of the city versus the role of the coalition versus the role of the new organization that's been created?
Yeah, and so in San Antonio, I think through the efforts of the last few years of kind of socializing the digital divide, getting organizations more involved. We have a Digital Inclusion Alliance of San Antonio that was kind of the informal volunteer group that just kind of stepped up and, through all of their hard work of getting to our city council, getting to our county commissioners, created kind of that relationship building of describing what the digital divide was and why we should all care about it. And then, of course, with the pandemic, it just kind of created this re-emphasis on its importance, and everybody got hit. So if you hadn't had your aha moment about the digital divide, you definitely had it during the pandemic. So it hit workforce, education, telehealth, all of these backup plans that had been built to tell our community members, well, go to your public library, go to your community center, go to this place. All of those places shut down. there wasn't anywhere that people could send to do, digital inclusion support, or just even accessing the internet. So it was really kind of that momentum that helped build an effort to do a strategic plan. So with the city of San Antonio, we had already been coordinating with our county, and we had implemented a digital inclusion survey and assessment. And again, with the city, we wanted to create kind of core functions that then we could all kind of feed from. So we had this baseline data set of where the digital divide was in our community. It was self-reported data, something that we can use to kind of articulate and use to kind of argue the data that is being kind of fed through the FCC and other places about who really is in this digital divide, how many people do we actually have disconnected. So that kind of helped us form an entity, which is now SA Digital Connects, that is taking on kind of an advocacy piece. So that is a public-private public coalition. It's an unincorporated non-for-profit, but its intent isn't to take money and implement strategies or projects. Its intent is solely to help us all kind of be on the same page, sharing data sets, sharing information, sharing alignment, sharing aspirational goals to what we're trying to achieve with this infrastructure fund, and any dollars that we also potentially get from ARPA, so that we're all kind of going in the same direction. But their role, honestly, is just mostly in the advocacy piece of trying to get local leadership to put money from ARPA into digital inclusion, trying to get private sector to understand and know what is happening so that they can be involved and support. Obviously, at the state level as well, we just have a newly formed state broadband office, so we're trying to influence with our data set and our information to ensure that we are also kind of pushing them a little further along with aspirational goals and not just settle for the minimums. But yeah, so we're kind of trying to figure out how we're all going to work together. If the city takes on money, obviously we're going to be responsible for overseeing, coordinating, and implementing it. But there's going to be other entities, universities, schools, other community-based organizations that are going to be able to go for this money. And we just want to make sure that we're sharing data, that we're all kind of going towards the ultimate goal and collaborating as much as possible. So that is kind of what we're trying to achieve here in San Antonio, but it's definitely a work in progress.
Super, thank you. Carrie, can you talk a bit about who now takes money and who can't take money, and then who is doing work in the collaborations across different coalition partners?
Well, as you can tell from both Jordan and Candelaria's answers, this is not easy. It's a big, hairy monster we have to wrestle to the ground in some way, and it's complicated. And just understanding what digital inclusion is itself is complicated, right? I mean, it's about broadband, it's about who has access, it's about who actually has access, meaning they can get a plan, but they can't afford a plan, versus somebody who doesn't have a plan option at all because there is no infrastructure there. And then who provides services and what do those services look like? So, and then I think it complicates everything so much when we have this wonderful, incredible opportunity of funding, state, local, but mainly the federal funding that's going to come down a chain that we're not exactly clear how it's going to flow or who's going to get it. So, I mean, there are so many moving parts. And so I think, one of the things that I know that NDIA and other organizations are promoting is get a coalition together. And I think that's so smart because you want to have a group of people who are like-minded and thinking the same things, or at least all on the same page about what are we doing and who's doing what where. But that's also can be really daunting for anybody who's out there. It's like, how in the heck do I start a coalition now? And who do I need to talk to? And who's going to be responsible for this? And so, I mean, I would just, caution or say, first of all, that if you are going to plan a coalition, that you really, really do need to have clarity up front about those things, like who is running it and what are the resources that I think the resources for whoever's going to be responsible for running a coalition need to be really clear, because it takes time. And, everybody has a real job, and many of these coalitions are put together as volunteer, we care about this work, right? We want to see it done well. But it also means somebody has to put meeting invites together. Somebody has to set the agenda. So who's it going to be? And I think as we know, with this influx of so much funding possible, there's now other people who are involved. The Chamber of Commerce is now involved. That everybody sees this as an important area. So I guess our coalition in Kansas City and others, we were not a formal 501c3. We don't have any real super formal structure. And so I think that was a little bit of a challenge when all of this happened, because people knew about our coalition and they knew the work that we did, but then they were saying, okay, well, we want to give you money. We want to infuse a bunch of money into this problem immediately. But we didn't have an ability or a way to do that, which I think is okay. But going forward, I still think the coalition needs to be a group of people who are meeting, and as Candelaria said, going in the same direction, thinking about things in the same way. But I feel strongly that if you don't have, and I think Jordan can tell us more, but in Franklin County, if you don't have a structure, you're not a 501c3, I do think that there needs to be an advisory group of people who are neutral, who don't have a vested interest in any way about the funding. So even if you're a library, you have some vested interest, not as much, but if any number of nonprofits are going to want or need the money. So I think that there needs to be some real oversight and transparency about what projects are selected and how are they selected, and how can we make sure that the people, whether it's a small neighborhood association, in a community that hasn't had the support in the past, they are just as critical as a library or as a university. They may be able to reach a group of people that we can't just by their location. So I just think it's so important that there has to be opportunities for everybody, but there has to be real oversight and an advisory capacity by people who don't have, a stake in the funding, but can be a resource to help you maneuver the funding piece itself.
We are in a really unique point in time, right? Where, wait, there's money?
Lots of money.
Sometimes we have to what? And I've talked to folks in other fields and they're like, how unusual you are, the situation you're in right now, right? I'm like, yeah, I get it. And it's temporary. And I get that it's temporary, that there's funding now through ARPA and other stimulus funds, and there's more money coming from the Infrastructure Act, but that's not permanent. And so a lot of what you all are doing in your coalitions, that building those connections and building that advocacy, it's what's going to help push for the continued funding, more funding later. And Carrie's question of how that money gets spent right now, that's a big issue. And it's going to cause probably knockout fights in some communities, right? Like folks are going to have different ideas on how the money should be spent. Some of the research that the Franklin County folks are doing has really knocked my socks off. So Jordan, would you mind sharing a bit of that, please?
Sure. And I would like to just acknowledge Candelaria and San Antonio for their planning work, because it really inspired us for a parallel planning process that we're going through that hopefully creates that discipline and neutral structure to be able to make priorities for funding and recommendations of what is most needed. But the way that we're going to do that is really through the resident voice. And so we've been doing a lot of work directly with residents over the past year in an approach called human-centered design with the Community Foundation and through Smart Columbus, where we've been going deep in interviews and co-design sessions and focus groups to spend hours of time really understanding what their lived experience is and how, in their perspective, what's needed, and not just like what's needed in terms of I need a better device, but in terms of what's needed in terms of how we connect with residents, or how do residents want to connect with each other in this space? Who's the trusted advisors that they trust to tell them what is an affordable, accessible broadband option for them, right? Are we using the right language when we're talking about internet or Wi-Fi or wireless or internet? I mean, it's such a critical, essential component of everyone's life. And to walk into this naively thinking that there's a population of people that just don't know how to get online is just completely false in the modern world. And so this population that we hope to serve from seniors to housing insecure, new Americans, underrepresented populations, all have really critical relationships with technology that both bring frustrations and emotion, safety, connection, well-being, and opportunity to their lives. And we got to get more in touch with how and why we're solving these problems, because I think what's most important to the residents should be most important in our funding priorities. And that is the only way we can put the mirror to ourselves to say, is this really the most important thing? Are we going to spend $1 million on something that maybe only 50 residents think is valuable, right? Like, how do we really check ourselves on that? So we're trying to bring the resident voice as front and forward into our planning process as possible, so that we can also, and this has happened twice now, where we've laid it all out in a roadmap against one user need, and we realize, wow, we're not even solving this problem. Like, this isn't even being addressed. Like, we thought it was this, right? And I think that's just a really, really powerful exercise than just a typical kind of framework.
Super. Thank you, Jordan. With all of this money coming, sometimes those who want to be helpful are then like, oh, the feds have it covered, and walk away, right? But the feds don't have it covered yet. And so there is still a need for not only funding from outside sources, non-federal, but just partnership and support. What are some of the things you need, that your coalition needs, that your own institution needs, that the partnerships that you have, that you're working with? What are the things you need?
I do think, as I mentioned, I think Jordan and Candelaria have already expressed like the importance, and they've done it. They've had the discipline and they've created more structure within their coalitions. And so I think making sure, right now, I think there needs to be, whether it's part of the funding from the federal government or within communities, funders, or where the support's going to come from, is just sustained support right now for this effort to collaborate, this effort to coalesce, this effort to decide, how can we make a real mark? How can we make the most of this incredible opportunity that we have? How can we, gather? I think there needs to be a lot of involvement, corporate America, cities, states, schools, nonprofits, residents, as Jordan said, but there has to be support for this effort of gathering right now. This prep work is so important right now that I just think that would be my ask is, we need all hands on deck. And that means, funding for positions, even if it's like consulting positions who we can come in and do real work that help support what we're trying to say. If it's studies or, focus groups or surveys or gatherings, whatever it's going to be, that I feel like that's what we need is some of this just like basic, almost community organizing in a way, if you will, but in a way that is equitable and bringing as many people to the table as possible.
I forget the exact amount, but Charlotte has gathered 60 million. And it's a little bit of ARPA money, but it's also corporate money. And it's about putting together plans. It's about coordination. It's about the services themselves. It is a new entity that they are creating there. But I think it goes to Carrie's point about the sustainability. I think it was in the NTIA's request for comments where they ask about this question. And part of me gets really like, okay, look, if we require sustainability, those smaller organizations, they just won't, because they don't have a sustainable plan. They're like trying to get by day to day. So we have to be realistic about that whole, it needs to be sustainable. Like, we want it to be sustainable, but somebody's got to step up to make it sustainable. Because that small mom and pop organization that's teaching digital literacy, they don't have a sustainability plan. They're barely getting by day to day, but we want them providing those services.
Yeah, exactly. I would just say that, and aspirational too, right? Because I think NTIA and even the broadband offices, they are looking for big projects. They want to make an impact here. And so maybe that's the other thing is I'm just challenging all of us to don't think small, think big, like what is really going to make the biggest impact and how can we do that? And I think that's going to help the broadband offices, get excited about supporting whatever big project your community is going to do, because then they can say, okay, this is fantastic. And then they can go back to NTIA and say, look at this, look what we have here and look at the impact we're going to make. And that's why we need X amount of dollars and you'll get more. I think that's a strategy that I believe in.
And I feel like maybe San Antonio is a little bit further ahead of some communities, but I would love your perspective on this. But I really do think there's a capacity shift going on locally around, a lot has been burdened on top of technology offices in cities or at schools or at libraries, and people have had, general assumptions that this role is in my job description. But there's a lot of conversation, at least in our community, going on around what is our capacity building strategy around this work, because there is money coming in, but it can't just be added on to the plate of people whose jobs that already exist, right? And I think that is a big kind of shift in terms of what does this team, what are the skill sets that are needed, what decisions are these people like responsible for, and how do they show up in these coalitions now when they have day-to-day authority of this? This isn't, there's a whole tribe of people now who are like, waking up and doing this work. We used to say, we need someone waking up and doing this work every day. And now we're like, well, there are people in 5 organizations now waking up and doing this work. So I think that's going to continue to grow. And I think that's a new dimension of the entire ecosystem, but we're feeling it on the ground is you have a lot of people waking up and doing this work now. It's not just volunteer. And how does that change the dynamic? How does that change the organizing structure?
How do we make sure those positions stay doing this work and have the funding to continue doing this work, and somebody else isn't like, oh, let's just take half of that job and they can come do this other thing? Candelaria, can you tell us about the position title that you have right now? What can you share about how that came to be and what you think about the sustainability of that position?
Yeah, definitely. So again, kind of tied back to the momentum and the work and all of the advocacy that occurred around digital inclusion and digital equity in San Antonio during our last budget process. We're really talking about that. We really don't have a person doing this at the city. It was part of Smart Cities. And I think to that effect, it helped. And it makes sense, right? How are you going to be a smart city if you have so many of your community members that are disconnected and strongly affected by any tiny minor thing, especially the pandemic not being minor? It literally caused people to die. So for us, it was just reiterating the importance of having a stronger effort around this and a stronger capacity, that it wasn't just you do smart cities and digital inclusion. So we did get that momentum and our city leadership approved a position of digital inclusion administrator for the city of San Antonio. I think we're still kind of building on if we're going to add additional resources to that position to kind of help, because it's still a lot. You guys mentioned just so many pieces. So I'm going to be responsible for coordinating efforts internally with city departments, like our Department of Human Services, our Neighborhood and Housing Services Department, our Parks and Rec, our libraries that already do a lot of digital inclusion work. But again, and ensuring that we're leveraging resources as much as possible, it's also connecting with our community-based organizations and pulling in our efforts so that we can, again, amplify what we're trying to do and get it to our community members in the most easiest way possible. So it's definitely a first step. And so we're just kind of continuing to advocate for additional resources so that we can be prepared not only today, but tomorrow. And it is a permanent position. So there's definitely a sustainability factor of the digital inclusion administrator. So we'll see how it evolves as we go through this process.
That is super exciting, can I say, right? That it's a permanent position. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left. So big question for all of you. For the communities that are struggling to figure out how to get something going, whether it be a coalition or improved coordination amongst a few organizations, what is advice that you would give to to a community? Think of a community that's newer into this space and figuring out what it is, early steps that they can take. Who would like to go first? Jordan has wisdom. Excellent.
I would say two things: understand your data, get aligned on the case for change that motivates your community. And then I would also say start a really broad net of a landscape and assessment and bring in as many unique and different contributors to the solution as possible. I think the more at the beginning sets you up for success long-term.
That's perfect. Thank you. Candelaria.
I would add to that, collaboration is definitely important. Bring in your trusted community-based organizations. They probably have the pulse of the community down a lot better than you do. And just to amplify what Jordan said, make it a regional approach, especially if you're a smaller city. Even us as San Antonio, we're working with Austin, Houston, Dallas, Harris County, Travis County, Bexar County. So whenever you can kind of get together and brainstorm and workshop and, share frustrations and coordinate on aspirational goals, because at the end of the day, we all want to make sure that we're future-proofing our infrastructure as much as possible and being strategic with these dollars. And again, we're all going to have similar pain points, so why not work together on them?
Perfect. Thank you, Candelaria. Carrie.
I agree with both those great answers, but I would also just throw in, I think you should include, make sure that you include in your process people from the city, people from the county, people from the library system. These are institutions that are going to be there regardless. Many of them are, if they're not doing this work actively, they should be. If your city or county isn't involved, they should be involved. And so I think there's always going to be a community grassroots effort and concern and care from neighborhood groups or nonprofits. But I think you need some of those stronger institutions that are always going to be there that can help be a trusted gathering place like a library. And then we just are going to have city, county, state support, because that's the way the funding is going to flow. And so I just think those have to be strong, critical relationships. And if you don't have them on board, you have to, as Jordan said, get the data and show them why this is such an important investment. It's about jobs, it's about quality of life, it's about the growth of your community. So you have to get them involved, right up front.
Perfect. Thank you. Big thank you to my 3 Rockstar panelists, and thank you to HTTP for having us for this conversation. If folks want more information about digital equity and how all this is happening, NDIA has a robust community that these 3 amazing rock stars are part of, and we welcome you into that community. There's more info at digitalinclusion.org.
A citizen looks out for everyone. Make sure they're included. We're out to give 10 million youth the resources they need to thrive, with digital access and technical skills, so they don't feel so distant from learning, whether they're here or here. Access to a promising future. That's our promise moving forward. Citizen Verizon, our plan for economic, environmental, and social advancement.
Want to know a really cool and nerdy fact about email that you can totally share at dinner parties? Oh, and this dinner party thing is a series, so you're going to want to hit follow. When email first came on the scene a few decades ago, lawmakers had to decide, was this electronic messaging more similar to a postcard or a letter? And this decision had massive implications for privacy. If email was considered to be more like a postcard, it would have no reasonable expectation of privacy of the information, aka snooping and surveillance is totally fair game. But a letter has the reasonable expectation of being private, and it's protected from unauthorized opening or snooping. The courts ended up considering email to be more similar to a letter. And thank goodness, emails are given heightened protection from snooping under pre-existing laws.
Hello, and welcome. I'm Ramiro Cavazos, President and CEO of the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, America's largest small business advocacy group. Thank you for joining HTTP for what will continue to be an educational and empowering virtual summit. The United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce represents 5 million Hispanic-owned businesses spread out across America, contributing over $800 billion to the American economy each year. And without the infrastructure and resources to make digital equity a reality, our communities will continue to face barriers to economic advancement and not progress the way they should. USHCC, we will continue to advocate for policies that would help our Hispanic businesses not only recover from the losses that were brought about by the pandemic, but also continue to integrate and contribute to a prosperous and sustainable global economy. After all, Latinos represent the 7th largest economy in the world, and we speak multiple languages, so we are global and we're ready to grow. We explore the countless innovative opportunities available and necessary for Hispanic business owners to be successful. These advocacy efforts include support for our small businesses, protection for more innovation, and privacy in the data economy that we're all living in. However, without more inclusive and equitable access to inner city communities, rural communities, low-income communities, this access to technology, including affordable internet, digital devices, and digital skills for all of us, will slow our recovery from the pandemic and other challenges that will allow us, unfortunately, to remain stagnant as a growing economy. So we encourage all Hispanic business owners to participate in government and private public sector initiatives that will help leverage more federal resources, creating win-win opportunities to help them grow while additionally holding these institutions accountable. It's access, it's equity, it's diversity and inclusion, especially with our technology, that's important. So we want to hold everyone accountable, including ourselves, and participate in protecting the rights of all consumers, support consumer choice, prioritize public safety, and of course, incentivize broadband internet infrastructure build out for the future. When we bridge the digital divide, we build a diverse and more inclusive workforce, and we all know that we're having workforce challenges, and we need to make that easier every day. And by doing this, we know that when we prioritize the rise of America's small and minority-owned businesses and our communities, our country's wider economic outlook improves. A rising tide will lift all boats. Please continue the conversation with us online throughout the day. And thank you to HTTP, along with our coalition members and partners for making this summit possible. On behalf of our board of directors, our team, and all of our members across the country, the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce stands in strong solidarity with HTTP. Enjoy, and thank you once again.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. We all know that fast and reliable internet access is vital for everyday life. We connect with family, work remotely, schedule telehealth appointments, and try to finish homework on time. But that access isn't always equal or affordable. More than 30 million Americans still do not have reliable broadband. 25% of Hispanic children live in households without high-speed internet. And almost 20% of Hispanic teenagers don't have access to a computer at home at all. But thanks to President Biden's leadership, Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which includes nearly $50 billion in funding for the Commerce Department to achieve the goal of high-speed, affordable broadband for all Americans. With these resources, we'll be bringing broadband infrastructure to every corner of our country, making service affordable for everyone, and ensuring users have the services, skills, and devices that they need. The Commerce Department's National Telecommunications and Information Administration, also called NTIA, has launched the new Connecting Minority Communities program, which will help Hispanic-serving institutions, HBCUs, and tribal colleges get online. These campuses are vital community centers that fuel job creation, entrepreneurship, and economic growth. In the coming months, we will distribute over $250 million through this program to help these institutions purchase broadband service and equipment, hire IT personnel, and create digital literacy programs. With dependable internet access, we increase the opportunity for everyone to succeed in the 21st century global economy. I want to thank you for the important work HTTP is doing to create an equitable digital economy. Working together, we're going to close the digital divide for good, strengthen our communities, and cement our future competitiveness. Thank you.
Want to help kids get their homework done? Well, an internet connection is a good start. But kids also need computers. And sometimes the hardest thing about homework is finding a place to do it. So why not hook community centers up with Wi-Fi? For kids like us and all the amazing things we're going to learn.
Through Project Up, Comcast is committing $1 billion so millions more students can continue to get the tools they need to build a future of unlimited possibilities.
I hope you're ready, because we are.
I'm Lily Gangas, the Chief Technology Community Officer at the Caper Center, an operating foundation at the intersection of technology and racial justice, providing research and thought leadership, operating programs, supporting strategic partnerships, and investments to increase diversity across the tech ecosystem. We aim to level the playing field in tech. At the Caper Center, we believe that technology has the power to solve pressing problems and close long-standing racial and social disparities across sectors. And we also know that communities of color have yet to fully benefit from the power of tech and the potential to advance economic mobility and innovation. Evident to this was all the ways in which we saw the pandemic bringing renewed attention to these longstanding and significant disparities, specifically in access to broadband and technology devices that are so critical in this increasingly digital-driven world. Through my work at the Caper Center of working directly with the community, I saw the massive need and urgency to help connect students and families through city and statewide collectives. And we started here specifically in Oakland. And through partnership work with organizations doing the direct of the work, it was also a personal time of reflection for myself. Given I saw myself reflected in the faces of the students who were disconnected, who were like me, immigrants, non-English speaking, came from single parent households and didn't have somebody to advocate for them. I knew that I could have been that child disconnected out in East Oakland. But fortunately, there are programs and there are collectives that were tackling this directly on. And so I apply these grassroots insights into the work that I do at the Caper Center. And through co-leading the Oakland Undivided Policy and Community Engagement Group at the city level, I was able to also learn of the possible solutions and also look for ways to advocate at the state level, specifically at the California level. And I proactively continue to help guide some of these largest funding opportunities of our generation in broadband access towards the communities that need it the most. Additionally, I joined the FCC Diversity and Inclusion Working Group, focused on providing guidance on digital discrimination and workforce pathways. Centering these working groups on racial, economic, accessibility, geographic equity is critical. The FCC Commissioner Rosenbluth quoted saying, "Your zip code should not determine your access to broadband," which this pandemic has proven is a must-have, just like electricity and water. And I share that because it is very important to acknowledge the discrimination that has happened before the digital divide is even experienced due to past generations of redline practices that resulted in unequal access in housing options for mortgage appraisals, loans, and overall public and private sector investments. And if we fast forward to this present generation, one of the glaring observations is how these discriminatory outcomes are still mirrored into who has access to fast enough, affordable internet access at home. This is how digital redlining is being manifested. Fortunately, as we get more accurate mapping and more policies, we know we can tackle and end this digital redlining now. This is why elected leaders like Representative Yvette Diane Clark are tackling this issue head on. Representative Clark's Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 provided momentum on addressing digital redlining as a nation. And this is why it is my honor to introduce Representative Clark from New York to share the call to action for this generation. Please welcome Representative Clark.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Yvette D. Clark, and I proudly represent New York's 9th Congressional District in Central and South Brooklyn. Before we begin, permit me to thank you all for joining us for this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. You know, today, more than 19 million American households lack reliable broadband. When considering that a significant number of these families live predominantly in Black and Brown communities and are intentionally redlined from broadband access, this already distressing figure becomes more daunting and haunting. Moreover, it becomes a cause for action. Over the past decade, and particularly within recent years, the internet has become an essential means for traversing our modern society. Despite this undeniable truth, internet service providers continue to digitally redline communities of color on the basis of nothing but callous greed and racism, in effect, stripping individuals of equitable access to educational, employment, entrepreneurial opportunities, affordable housing, telehealth, and any number of critical services that are increasingly only available online. This discriminatory practice has already tragic consequences and are not limited to individuals. They extend to our families, their communities, as well as small, diverse enterprises with poor broadband that cannot hope to attract new businesses and residents and or fear competition in the marketplace when their neighbors are equipped with superior broadband options. So let me be clear, broadband access must be a right, not a privilege, and digital redlining extends racial discrimination from the physical world into an ever-expanding virtual civil society, full stop. That's why I've introduced the Anti-Digital Redlining Act to protect the right in underserved and underrepresented communities nationwide. Simply put, this practice of creating and perpetuating inequities between already marginalized groups, specifically through the purposeful withholding of digital technologies, digital content, and the internet. This cannot and must not continue. My legislation would allow the FCC to investigate discriminatory practices undertaken by internet service providers based on income, race, color, religion, national origin, and other factors within a geographic area and prohibit these service providers from entering exclusive agreements with multi-dwelling units or landlords that would limit competition, consumer choice, or favor any particular provider, as well as much, much more. In other words, the Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 would ensure equitable access to high-quality, affordable broadband coverage in marginalized communities by preventing the practices that create digital redlining. And we must prevent these practices from flourishing because, as we know, broadband is a necessity. Broadband is transformative, and broadband is a right and not a privilege. The Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 is needed to protect that right in underserved and underrepresented communities across our nation. Bridging a digital divide that grows wider with each passing day is no small feat, and my legislation is a very significant piece in this vital effort. It is an essential, crucial, and critical piece. If America still hopes to proclaim itself the land of opportunity, then it is our responsibility to make that a reality for all Americans, however long it takes. So thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, get vaccinated and boosted, and most of all, take good care. Thank you once again.
Hello there, and welcome again to the Digital Inclusion Summit 2022. I'm Dr. Nicordelai Corte, National Affairs Contributor to the GRIO, guest lecturer at Pepperdine University, Graduate School of Education and Psychology, and the former senior policy advisor, one of the former senior policy advisors to the Biden-Harris campaign. I'm really delighted to be a part of the Digital Inclusion Summit particularly at this inflection point in our history. So many opportunities in the days ahead, and we're looking forward to talking a little bit about those opportunities. Before I introduce our guests that will be joining me for this fireside chat, I want to set the table a little bit. And first things first, I want to acknowledge just the leadership of Representative Yvette Clarke of New York. I want to recognize her and her incredible staff for the work that they've done in advancing the anti-digital redlining proposal that was included in the infrastructure package that passed Congress and was signed into law by President Biden. That proposal, those set of proposals really represent a giant step forward for folks that have been working on broadband issues and have been working to address digital redlining for some time. In redlining, where have we heard that term before? That's really at the center of this conversation. When we talk about redlining here in the United States, we're talking about the discriminatory practice in which services, financial and otherwise, were withheld from potential customers who resided in neighborhoods classified as hazardous to investment. Those residents largely belong to, that's right, you guessed it, racial and ethnic minorities. And some of the most well-known examples involve denial of credit, of insurance, denial of health care, and the development of food deserts in minority neighborhoods have also attributed to redlining in many instances. That's sort of the brick and mortar version of redlining. We're going to talk about digital redlining today. We're going to talk about what that is, how it started, and the legacy that we have to contend with. And to go deeper on that, right now I want to introduce Vincent Lay, the Senior Legal Counsel for Technology and Equity at the Greenlining Institute in my home state of California. Vincent, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And so, first things first, tell us, what is digital redlining and how does it affect important aspects of our everyday lives?
Right. So, redlining in the past was redlining on the basis of, race and ethnicity and lack of access to services. So digital redlining is just the modern version of that, in particular focusing on when internet service providers build out their broadband networks in high income areas, while lower income neighborhoods are left with slower or more expensive options or no options at all. And that impacts a lot, right? So when you have more expensive or slower internet, you have lower adoption, right? Less people sign up for the internet, and there's higher prices because of less competition and investment due to redlining. So without that access, you have lower digital literacy skills, and then that means you have a lower ability to get good jobs. And wage growth is highest in jobs that have high digital literacy skills, and this access and skills gap is in large part due to lack of access to the internet. And in particular today, right, 42% of U.S. workers were working from home nearly full time, right? So internet access is key for employment outcomes. Academically, if you have internet access, you're 6 to 8% more likely to graduate high school. Classes today during the pandemic all require online access to just do your homework or even log in to watch your teacher lecture. And finally, you get 10 to 20% higher math, science, and reading scores. So that's why greenlining focuses so much on this digital redlining issue, because digital redlining denies access to economic opportunity, just like redlining in the past denied access to home buying and other forms of wealth building.
And Vincent, can you talk a little bit about what some of the structural underpinnings of digital redlining are? I've read about and I've heard a number of scholars and practitioners alike talk about the role that algorithmic bias, for example, plays in enabling digital redlining. Can you talk a little bit about the structural underpinnings of this practice?
Yeah, so I think we need to start back in the past, right? The 1940s when redlining happened, right? That in those times, there were rules created by the government, insurers, banks, that said certain neighborhoods were hazardous, like you said. And that meant the lack of access to investment. The practice of redlining ended in the 1970s with the passage, of anti-discrimination laws. But the impact of that was a massive racial wealth gap, where white families had on average 10 times the wealth of Black ones, and a gap that's only growing. And that's because those neighborhoods that were redlined didn't have access to loans, mortgages, home ownership, education, the key building blocks to economic opportunity. Now take that today, right? Redlining on the basis of race is illegal. But what businesses do, they make investment decisions based on income now. They have, algorithms, they have a lot of different data crunching methods to determine where they want to invest. And it just so happens the neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous in the past are unprofitable or not worth investing in today. And that's because of that racial wealth gap caused by redlining. So, I think the structural underpinnings is because of that historical practice. And what happened is redlining just shifted form from discrimination based on race or ethnicity to discrimination based on income.
And I think the natural next question is, how do we fix this problem? You heard me at the top of this conversation give a shout out to Representative Clark and her team around some of the work that they've done in terms of advancing anti-digital redlining proposals. The proposal that was a part of the infrastructure package, very high level. Can you share with us sort of what was in that anti-digital redlining package that made it through Congress and was signed by the president? What was in that? And how might some of the proposals in that package help to fix the problem? And what else can we do to fix the problem?
Yeah, actually, that package was kind of like a wish list for a lot of us in the consumer side of this issue, right? We have the Affordable Connectivity Program, Emergency Broadband Benefit, which tackled one of the major parts of the digital redlining and the internet adoption problem by providing lower cost access to the internet, right? Affordability was the big problem. So we did that with the EBB and the ACP programs. And then we also had a lot more investment in areas that are unprofitable, right? There's not enough competition. So there's more money available to build out the internet. And then finally, we have the digital redlining investigation. I think it's really important that we begin to get good data and investigate which neighborhoods have been redlined by these practices, right? And then when we find that out, we can begin to direct a lot of funding to kind of close that investment gap, to incentivize internet service providers to build there, to make sure people get fast internet and they can access the economic opportunity there. But I think we're in the early stages. This is going to take time to implement. And we have to make sure that there's a lot of rulemakings going on right now to implement those rules and making sure that all that funding and those services that we were created go to the right places.
And are there any sort of new support structures that are needed that we need to put in place to extend digital opportunity to everyone? I mean, if we were practicing radical imagination, what could we do? You mentioned that the proposal that Representative Clark and others have championed, consists of a wish list of items from consumer advocates like yourself. But what didn't make it on to that list that would be a demonstration of radical imagination in terms of solving digital redlining?
Yeah, I think the major missing piece right now is the outreach part, right? We have all of these new programs. We have ways for families to get devices, internet access that they can afford, but people don't know about it, right? There was a survey by AT&T saying, 55% of those that were surveyed didn't even know about that program, the Affordable Connectivity Program. 2/3 of households in California that are eligible haven't signed up. So there needs to be a more targeted focus on outreach. And I think that is very hard, right? I think what we need to do is work with trusted messengers within communities, right? Community organizations that folks can go to and learn about this program, can help people sign up, and then actually begin to take advantage of all these new programs that are available. So I would like to see, in the grant funding available to provide grants to community organizations to get the word out to the folks that need it.
So speaking of what you'd like to see, what do you hope to see included in the FCC's report?
Yeah, so I think I love the data. I'm really excited to see where they go. I would like to see the demographic and racial breakdowns of which communities have access to high-speed internet and investments. I want to compare outcomes in communities that have good access to broadband and those that don't. We can look at a wide variety of economic indicators, economic growth, academic outcomes, to see what tie there is to this digital redlining and the health and wealth of these communities. I think that can help us create the pressure to finally solve this problem and get the connectivity that we need. And then I also want to look at competition, right? I think that's the biggest part of what drives prices down and what gets more investment. So we need to see which communities have more choice and what we can do to build that competition. And then finally, I want a comparison of all the industry players. Who's a good actor? Who's willing to invest in communities that may not be as profitable, but are just as important, right? That we want to build up, and who hasn't been doing that, right? So I think naming and shaming at some level is important, at least on the consumer side, to make sure that our internet service providers are, doing what they should be.
That's great. Those are all really great opportunities for us to move this issue forward. In recent years, we've seen so many examples of leaders in a number of different industries, the banking industry, the tech industry, among others, that find their way onto the Hill. They're invited on the Hill to testify, before members of Congress, for example. Sometimes the banter that we hear between members and these private sector leaders, sometimes it feels like it's missing the mark a little bit. It's falling short of that radical imagination that I spoke of earlier. What types of questions do you think that the federal government should be asking themselves and should be asking private industry?
Yeah, I'll start with private industry. I think, we need to be outraged that a lot of, in areas that happen to be low income, disproportionately people of color, they're charging the same price for old, slow internet as they are in wealthier, wider areas that have faster internet. Right. So I want to know, how do you justify that profiteering, off the backs of communities of color with substandard service for years, and you have no investment while you spend all that money in wealthier neighborhoods. So I want to know why and how they justify that. Right. I think another question is, with these subsidy programs that are out there, we're giving internet service providers money to build networks. We're giving consumers money to purchase the services from the private industry. So, what incentive is there for them to lower their prices or to provide good services if we keep doing this, right? What do we need to do to make sure that you are good corporate citizens, you're not abusing all this funding that is going to you, to make sure that people have access to, what is a utility, a critical service in our 21st century life. And then for the federal government, I think the question is, is this a permanent program, the Affordable Connectivity Program? And if so, right, how do we make sure that we have the rules out there to make sure that these internet service providers are being good corporate citizens? They're not digitally redlining. They're investing in the communities that need it the most. So, those are the type of questions I would want to ask. Yeah.
Well, we have a pretty broad audience of folks that are watching this session right now. There's some folks who work in tech policy, folks that are digital natives and may not be as much of digital natives as others. I want to ask you this last question before we bring this to a close. Tell us something that we don't know. Tell us something that we don't know. Are there any trends that you see on the horizon? Are there any insights, that, may not get the attention that it's deserved in the headlines? Tell us something that we don't know about the future of digital redlining in the United States.
I think I'm gonna give you kind of a pitch for the work that we're doing, right? I think what we don't know is that you can't just throw money at this broadband problem, right? And that's kind of what's happened. And I think it's very welcome, but it is going to require a very community, local focus to make sure that these funds go to where they want. And that means recruiting people that aren't normally in the digital space, right? We're working on a program called the Town Link. We're working with food banks, churches, reentry centers, homeless populations, community organizations that don't do any broadband work. And then we're teaching them about all of these new programs that are available. And then they are going to people that they trust to provide that information. And that's what we need to do, right? So I think we need to make sure that at the federal level, these policy changes translate to the local community level to get to the people that don't have access to the internet.
Well, I want to thank you again. A big thank you to Vincent Lay, Senior Legal Counsel for Technology Equity at the Greenlining Institute. I really want to thank you for really helping to illuminate some of the challenges, but more importantly, some of the opportunities ahead in terms of expanding broadband access and really addressing the issue of digital redlining head on. The stakes couldn't be higher. Stakes couldn't be higher. You mentioned earlier, the impacts of not having an internet or having access to the internet couldn't be more stark. We've seen it throughout this pandemic. With all the millions of new jobs that have been created just in the past year or so, not having access to the internet means, less preparation for those jobs. It means, less digital skills. It means, having, potentially a negative effect on academic performance and so forth. And so thank you for making it plain, Vincent Lay. We appreciate you. And we appreciate all of the work of, again, Representative Clark and so many others that have been instrumental in advancing this agenda. You are attending the Digital Inclusion Summit for 2022. The future is digital, voices are diverse, and the impact is personal.
My parents came to the U.S. from Ethiopia. They would work 2 or 3 jobs each because they want to build a better life for me and my brother. They would always tell me when I was a kid, make sure you're studying, you're going to graduate college.
Education is important to us because the more education, the more you grow.
We want them to be better than us.
My name is Kareem, and I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. It was tough at first to try and figure out what I want to do for my career. So once I got into UNC Charlotte, I majored in management information systems because it was pretty broad and you had a couple options. I graduated December 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. It was definitely a rough time. It was months where I applied to hundreds of jobs, but I wasn't getting any calls back. On top of everything, I worked for a large electronic retailer part-time, but I got furloughed from that. So I really wasn't making any money. I kind of just felt stuck. You're like, okay, do I have to go back to get my master's? I'm like, what else do I need to do? I was trying to figure that out. I followed basketball statistics and I would always see percentages and trends in different players. And it always revolved around data. I just didn't know how to use it or work with it. So I started looking at different programs, different certifications, maybe going to like a boot camp or something. I stumbled onto a YouTuber named Alex the Analyst. He introduced me to the Google Data Analytics Certificate program. And I knew that this was something that I had to take in order to break that barrier. I put all my time and all my effort into the program. I learned coding with R, SQL, making graphs with data. And it felt really beginner friendly, where you can start this course not knowing anything about data analytics, and you can end feeling real comfortable about getting a job. After graduating from the Google program, it took me about a month to land a job at Infosys. Now I'm making salary, and I'm really enjoying getting to collaborate with my colleagues, trying to solve complex problems with the data points that we've got, and being out of my parents' crib.
I am so proud of Karim. Opportunity is here in America. If you want to be, you can be.
Hello, I'm Antonio Tijerino of the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and thank you for following along with HTTP's Digital Inclusion Summit 2022. As we continue the conversation about an inclusive and digital future for all, we also must remember the hard and collaborative work it will take to end the disparities in access to affordable internet service and closing the tech equity gap. While this includes empowering local and federal governments to use infrastructure funds to promote inclusive public policies that ensure equitable and access to broadband, it also means providing the tools for the Latino community for adoption and increased digital skills. For our community, this translates to having a choice of wired and wireless options available at an affordable price. It also means the availability of adoption and digital skill programs like my organization's, the Hispanic Heritage Foundation's Code as a Second Language effort, that helps underrepresented minorities develop the skills our youth and adults need to succeed in our 21st century digital economy. Without important access to broadband, along with sufficient digital services, our youngest learners continue to face barriers to a quality education. Our disabled communities are unable to access life-saving telehealth service. And workers that face job displacement are unable to access skills and training necessary to participate in a changing workforce. So thank you, HTTP, our partners and coalition members, for continuing this important discussion. And thank you to Senator Patty Murray and her ongoing efforts with the Digital Equity Act to ensure funds continue to help our communities.
Hi, everyone. This is Senator Patty Murray, and I'm delighted to join you all for this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. For so many of us, having a reliable broadband connection is almost as important today as running water or electricity. But for too long, it's been out of reach for so many people. That's why I worked to pass my bill, the Digital Equity Act, in the bipartisan infrastructure law President Biden signed last year. My bill will help make sure everyone has the tools and support to get online and will deliver funding to state and local entities who are on the ground and already leading when it comes to digital inclusion. And this is just one of many ways the bipartisan infrastructure law will help people in Washington state and across the country get online for less. The law will also put at least $45 billion towards expanding broadband coverage, reduce internet costs for households with low incomes, and more. The funding alone is going to be a big deal, but ensuring that digital inclusion is at the center of these investments will be so important to the overall success of this package. So I'm fighting to ensure that once someone has a reliable internet connection, they're able to make the most of it, creating opportunity for so many people in a big, big way. Thank you again for inviting me to join you all, and know I will continue to be your proud partner in the fight for digital equity.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on a conversation about expanding digital opportunity for every home, everywhere, and thinking about how broadband adoption, affordability, and digital skills are actually a racial equity issue, and how it's really important to think about these issues from the lens of racial equity to ensure that all of our communities are not only included, but really able to thrive and take advantage of all of the benefits that come with access to broadband. So we're really excited today to have a great panel for you. My name is Emily Chi. I'm the Director of Tech, Telecom, and Media at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and I'm really excited to have a panel. So first we have Brandon Forrester. He's national organizer with Media Justice. He is a phenomenal leader on all of these issues, and so we're really excited to have him. We also have Diego Snyder, who is a senior research manager at Aspen Latinos and does a lot of leadership around digital equity programs for Aspen Latino. So we're very lucky to have him with us today. And we also have Dr. Fallon Wilson, who is the Vice President of Tech Policy, Multicultural Media, Telecom and Internet Council. And she has been doing some great work around reaching communities where they are to make sure that they are included in our broadband outreach work. So we're really excited to have three people who are actively working in the communities, making sure that communities of color are connected and included, and that the policies that are built to serve them actually will serve them. So thank you all for your incredible work. So first, let's just start with understanding the gap. You know, we have had a lot of conversation, especially with the pandemic, about why the internet is essential and how there is a gap in connectivity. We often talk about, you know, how there's a rural divide from the urban divide. But what we don't hear as much about are the specific challenges that communities of colors face when we're talking about broadband connections, and why the strategies to reach them have to be targeted and specific. It can't be just a big mainstream outreach push. So maybe we can start with Dr. Fallon Wilson, and we'd love to go around and hear about what each of your organizations has been doing and how you're seeing the problem specifically for our communities.
Thank you so much for moderating, Emily. I'm very happy to be here. I work at the Multicultural Media Telecom Internet Council. It's a very long name, but we lovingly call it MMTC. And part of the work that we do for the last 36 years was to advocate for equity and parity within telecom, internet, innovation, and broadcasting. We have been behind some of the most important briefs around making sure that people of color have access to those spaces. I get to do great work because I get to work with, you know, the most hot topic of the moment, which is how to ensure that communities have access to internet. I don't say broadband often because I think that's also part of the challenge. The languaging of DC doesn't necessarily translate well to on the ground when trying to organize people. I think one church woman told me, I think she was a deacon. She's like, what is a broadband? Is it a bra, Fallon? I'm like, no, it's not a bra, Mother Montgomery. It is what we call internet. Well, why don't you just say internet, baby? And so if I had to begin my comments, I would say translation has been a challenge. But the bigger challenge for me is probably the ethos that happens when you want to help people of color and poor people in this country. The assumption by those who have the resources, right, is that if we build it, they will come. It is consistently, it is always the default mechanism for when we want to help communities. And like the Field of Dreams, just because you build it, they don't come, right? And so you have to build the networks too. And an example of that was the first iteration of the emergency broadband benefit. So we have an internet subsidy now, and it's great, and people will run to it. But oh my goodness, we have to do enrollment. Oh my goodness, we need money to do outreach. One of the main feedback that we got, because we work with African American churches across the country and denominations and non-denominations and nonprofits to educate them about digital equity. And one of the main challenges that came back to us was, Dr. Wilson, we agree with you. You don't have to sell us on this. The pandemic has shown that we need the internet, at least to connect with our parishioners and do our social ministries work, right? But the CDC The Center for Disease Control gave us money to do vaccines in our parking lots. We could buy, laptops and iPads to do registrations and enrollment and to do tracking. Is there any dollars from the federal communication to do this, to enroll people into the emergency broadband benefit? Once again, you build it, you think they come. And I had to tell them no. Why? Because we believe that waste, fraud, and abuse is the cornerstone of American democracy. We must guard against those things. When the truth of the matter is, we need to put more money and resources into community-based and cultural institutions on the ground to have an effective strategy for digital equity. And so I was happy, and I'm pretty sure both of my colleagues would agree, that in this new Affordable Connectivity Program moment, where the FCC does have dollars, right? But they don't know how to do granting, right? Because they're a regulatory body. And so that's a whole nother set of important challenges that we have to work through alongside the FCC. And so for me, when I think about why don't we have a movement on the ground, it's because those who have privileges and resources here within the DC Beltway, we have not necessarily figured out, number one, how to translate the language. And number two, we don't center community in our design ethics. They should be alongside of us co-creating this moment. But once again, we build the field of dreams and expect for them to come, and they don't. And they don't have to, actually. I don't feel bad. I don't penalize people for not coming to something that they didn't have ownership in.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Olson. Those are all such important points, and certainly a challenge that we're seeing at our organization, where it not only is the translation issue a problem, it's also, the levels of digital literacy. It's also how can all this information be online and the application itself be online when the whole point is to do outreach to folks who aren't online yet. So really understand, who are we designing for? Who are we actually trying to target? And what is their lived reality like? And how do we actually incorporate their input and their lived experiences? Like, how can we design for a group that we don't actually understand or include? So really great perspective to consider for those who are designing and building and drafting this type of legislation and policy. Thank you. So next I'll move on to Brandon with Media Justice. If you can talk a little bit about what you all are seeing with the racial digital divide and how you all are starting to work on it.
Yeah, I really appreciate being invited to be a part of this panel. And I think I'm going to parallel a lot of what Dr. Fallon shared. So to start off, Media Justice, we're an organization that's fighting for racial, gender, and economic justice in the digital age. We have a network, a Media Justice network of over 100 organizations that includes artists, artist collectives, community media makers, folks that are providing internet to people in community, like community technologists. It also involves folks at utility reform networks. So we have all kinds of folks in our network. And I think when we talk about this, we really should talk about it as a racial digital divide, not just as a digital divide. And you mentioned this kind of mythology, Emily, that we always hear about urban versus rural. And of course, that's racial coding. When they're saying urban, that's coded for Black people. And when they say rural, that's coded for white people. And we know that that's not true. We know that actually the biggest gap is an affordability gap, and that impacts people in both urban and rural places, and also in tribal areas. But we also know, and it was really perfectly highlighted by a report out of the Joint Center, that the people that are furthest divided by the digital divide are the folks in the Black rural South. And so there we have Black folks in rural places who are part of the digital divide, despite this kind of mythology we have about the urban versus rural myth. And I think that for us, really, a lot of the conversations, a lot of the infrastructure money that we see, even the emergency broadband benefit, a lot of this, we're thinking about digital equity, but really what we're seeing is just trying to get people connected, basic access. We're talking really about just faster speeds and lower prices. And that's the smallest part, I think, of the fight that we have ahead of us. Because frankly, to kind of paraphrase, there's an incredible, second to the most recent edition of Logic Magazine had an article and an interview with Andre Brock Jr., who wrote the book Distributed Blackness, about Black culture online and Black kind of cyber cultures. And one of the things that he said in that interview was that, look, our people see the digital divide, they see what's on the other side of that bridge, they can peep that, and that's not for them. They don't want any part of it. I also heard that too. I went to Dr. Fallon's event last night, Broadband for Black Churches, and we heard the same thing. We heard that from the Reverend Doctor, we heard from the pastors, that people in their congregation don't necessarily want that digital divide they don't want that gap to be closed because they don't trust what's out there. The chat was blown up, and you know what people were talking about in the chat was privacy, was about digital surveillance. So these are the things we have to think about when we're talking about this. It's not just getting our communities access to good technological systems. We also have to think about all of these harmful systems that always have access to our people. And then the last thing that I'll say that ties to this also is, you know, I think a lot of what we hear is the solution is just competition, competition, competition. We know that there's an issue with monopoly, duopolies, where people don't have choices. But we also know that in a capitalist system, it's competition, a win or lose system that leads to monopolies. Monopolies don't just happen. They happen because we live in a win or lose situation. The real remedy is cooperation. It's collectivism at the local level. And so the only way that we're going to change this, because there was an FTC report that came out last year. Folks know that Google, Facebook, Amazon, these places are tracking you, participating in digital surveillance. But the report from the FTC said, wait a second, your internet service provider is doing just as bad or worse. And not just because they have a monopoly over your internet service, but they're these vertical monopolies. So they know what you're watching on television because they're your cable provider, they're your cell phone provider, and they can connect all of these places you're going, everything you're doing. They know everything about you. And so really the solutions that we have to have, like you were saying, we have to look at design. We have to involve community. And the only solutions that we're going to have are not having AT&T or Verizon or Comcast and more competition in more areas. We have to essentially abolish them. We have to do that by building out local solutions that are accountable to people. Now, that can look like community mesh networks, neighborhood networks. That can look like co-ops. That can look like small private businesses. But at the end of the day, it's got to be local solutions that our communities are a part of. And so I go on and on, but I'll stop there so I don't keep going on and on.
No, thank you. I think you've just given even more examples to bolster Dr. Wilson's point that having that active, input and having community members actually share what they think and how they feel is really important because, you just shared how one of the assumptions is that, well, people just don't know that internet is so valuable and why they should be on it. And if you talk to anyone who is an intended beneficiary of these programs, it's clear, no, they know that already. That's not the problem. And we would have known that if we even had one conversation with community. And Brandon makes your example of how a lot of these folks are very aware of some of the risks and dangers and harms that come from being connected and kind of want to resist that just reminds me of, we have to really rely on trusted messengers here because why would people trust a system and an agency and a government that has created the digital divide intentionally against their communities anyway, right? There's a history of these systems being built to exclude us, to harm us. And so for that entity to then reach out and say, hey, we created this great program for you without community input and engagement and trusted messengers just really doesn't make sense. And one thing that I'd love for us all to talk about, and maybe we can wait until we go to our third panelist, but is the role of historical redlining and what that means for what we're seeing today with digital redlining. Because it's not just, our communities don't have awareness or they don't see the value in internet. It really is an infrastructure problem where they've been excluded intentionally. So maybe that's something you all can think about and I'll ask about next. But before we do that, I will now pass it off to Diego, who is at Aspen Latino, to talk a little bit more about how you all are seeing it from the Latino perspective.
Thank you, Emily. It is really nice to be with all of you here today. Basically, the point that Brandon and Dr. Fallon made before about the importance of community-based organizations resonated with me and with the work we are doing at the Aspen Latinos Society. We are one of about 80 policy programs at the Aspen Institute. We were founded in 2015 with the goal of working towards more economic opportunity for the Latinos communities in the US. And we do so through different projects, but one of our main ones is the City Learning and Action Lab, an initiative that basically focuses on working with 7 Latino majority cities around the US with a steering committee in each of these cities that has community-based organizations, the local Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, local entrepreneurial ecosystem organizations, the city management office, in order to identify a strategic initiative that can support Latino businesses and Latino entrepreneurs to recover from COVID-19 and to thrive in the new economy. And of course, we understand that in the digital economy, technology is a must for Latino business owners, Latino entrepreneurs, and Latino workers to thrive and prosper. So this is one of our main buckets of work. And well, in terms of digital equity, there are plenty of gaps that affect the Latino community. As it was said before, it's not only about broadband connectivity, where Latinos are facing barriers in terms of accessing high quality, high speed internet at affordable prices. It's also about accessing digital devices that now, after the pandemic experience, we know that it's not about having one computer in a household. It's about every single member of the household having internet-enabled devices in order to be able to connect to education, in order to be able to connect to work, to connect with healthcare services. It's also about digital skills. There was a National Skills Coalition report in 2020 that identified that Latino workers are the demographic that has the lowest level of access to digital skill training. Around 57% of Latino workers have low to no digital skills, and this affects their possibility of accessing high-paid job opportunities. There is also a McKinsey Global Institute report from 2019 that identifies Latino workers as the demographic most at risk of job loss due to automation and digitalization. And this is because of many reasons, one of them being unequal access to higher education institutions, but also the fact that Latino workers are overrepresented in industries and sectors where automation and digitalization are actually replacing workers. In the example is industries such as retail, construction, manufacturing, agriculture, or hospitality. So there is a lot of work to be done in order to ensure that Latinos have full access to digital opportunity. In the Latino Society program, we also understand that it's not an issue of digital inclusion, it's about digital success, Latino digital success. And in order for this to happen, it's not only about making sure that Latinos are connected and are active users of technology, it's also about Latinos being creators of technology. So in this sense, there is a wide underrepresentation of Latinos in the tech industry. We did a report with Caper Center, a California-based NGO, last year, and we identified that Latinos nowadays represent barely 7% of tech occupations. They only represent 4% of tech leadership, only 2% of tech board members, only 2% of venture capital investment professionals, and only 2% of tech startup founders. So if we want to avoid technology to have harmful consequences for communities of color, we need to make sure that communities of color are represented in the technology sector, that they are creating the technology in order to make sure that that technology is answering to their needs and is not harming them through algorithmic biases. So we, at the Aspen Latinos and Society program, we are conducting research projects to better understand the needs of the Latino community around the US. It is very important to understand that the Latino community is highly heterogeneous, so there is no one-size-fits-all policy that can give an answer to the different needs of the Latino community. In this specific topic, it's not the same to answer to the needs of a Latino entrepreneur who is trying to remain competitive by adopting technology in its business model, or a Latino professional who is trying to open a career pathway in the technology industry, or a Latino frontline worker who is highly at risk of job loss due to automation. So the policies that need to be designed have to have this in mind. It is important to understand the different personas within the Latino community. And it's always important to work together with community-based organizations that are trusted by the community in order for those policies to have a proper outreach. So I think that's pretty much it for now, but I'm happy to continue with the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think you've done an excellent job of just showing how this issue is interconnected with so many other issues like economic opportunity, like diversity in the workplace, and how all of these elements are really important to achieving equity in this space. So I'd love to open it up to all of you now to kind of discuss, we've already kind of done this, but what are some of the historical or systemic issues at play? We talk about broadband as something that seems like it's kind of in a bubble sometimes, but what are the issues that are communities are regularly facing or have faced throughout history that we have to consider when we think about internet access policies that are going to actually lift up the specific communities that each of you serve? Maybe we can start with Brandon.
Yeah. Well, I want to return answer that question to what you mentioned before about digital redlining. And obviously that calls forth historical redlining. But I think that now we've really kind of actually narrowed what redlining was when we talk about digital redlining. Of course, if you look at the redlining maps of cities like Baltimore, Detroit, New York, all across the United States, and you look at those neighborhoods that were cut off or that our people were forced into, and you overlay the maps today of places that are not connected, it's the same map. It's the same map. We know that, but that's not all that digital redlining is. That's not all that redlining was. Redlining, of course, was about keeping people from having access to all of our cities and all of our resources and education and economic opportunity. But it was also more specific than that. It was about people's specific access to housing. It was a federal program. It was a state program. It was a city program. And so if we bring that forward to today, we also understand if we don't just think about access to helpful systems, but also these other systems and resources that we're excluded from. So it's not just digital inclusion, it's digital exclusion. We still see that through algorithmic bias, through targeted advertising, we know about the subprime home lending that particularly impacted Black and brown communities. Those people were targeted through digital advertising that was built on top of surveillance. So when we talk about digital redlining, it's important that we talk about the geographies of it. It's important that we look at those maps and understand, but it's also important that we understand that there's more to the history than just looking at those maps. There were regulations, there were policies, there was culture that was a part of that forced those things to happen. And so I think we need to think about that too. And so one of the examples I always think about is we have folks in Detroit that are part of our network. And I think about a student in Detroit during the pandemic that was just trying to get education. And they couldn't get access to the internet at home. Part of that might have been because they lived in a neighborhood where there just weren't wires. Part of that could have been because there just wasn't affordable internet. But the walk that student had to take to get to the internet, they were tracked by all kinds of technological systems. There were facial recognition systems that were cameras that were connected directly to fiber, but that fiber didn't go to those students' houses. And so I just want to expand what people are thinking when they think about digital redlining, to also think about it as not just the maps, but also everything else that made those maps possible.
Right. It makes me think back to what Dr. Wilson was talking about, also about where we make our decisions about where to invest money and resources, and how often that's not actually reaching the communities that we're trying to include. Dr. Wilson, I wonder if you can add some thoughts.
Oh, no, I agree with Brandon. I serve on the Communication, Equity, and Diversity Council for the Federal Communications Commission. And part of the charter is to deal with these types of intersecting issues, especially this new charter, this new iteration. And many of you know that FCC is looking for public comments on digital discrimination. And so for me, I situate there. This is not just about digital redlining. It is about all forms of discrimination that do not allow people of color in particular to make choices for their lives and for their families. I give the example all the time. I get to wear two hats. Nationally, I do policy work and I advocate. Locally in Nashville, Tennessee, I wrote our Smart City report through equity. I raised $200,000 from the pandemic to do a mixed methodology to study digital access and equity issues in Davidson County. So I know municipal politics very well. And I also know that they're not equally distributed when it comes to library dollars for public computing within Davidson County. I was floored maybe about 2 years ago when we were doing some research there to only realize that predominantly, affluent neighborhoods, predominantly white, got all the dollars to upgrade their libraries and digital access and access. Communities where there were immigrant and people of color, not so much. To me, that is digital discrimination. And it's not just, if you got to have an intersectional framework for talking about racial oppression in this world of digital resources, right? And I think digital redlining is important, but in addition to that, there's a host of other ways that people do, and to Brandon's point, not just historically, but currently create systems that keep Black and Brown and Latino and immigrant and undocumented communities from having access. I can even begin to talk about what it means to be a cashless society and then the roots from what that looks like. I can even begin to talk about telehealth, not just from the access point of view of connectivity, but what does it mean to have Black and melanated skin and your doctor doesn't understand that through visual, or you don't have the great pixelations of being able to upload video and they can see your skin as a dermatologist. What I'm trying to say is it would behoove us, as we do all the rulemaking at the federal level, to really put guardrails around digital discrimination that allows for a large swath of bad actors to be held accountable. And part of it is really looking at, anything that keeps Black and Brown, immigrant and undocumented communities from being able to make a free choice, not one that's constructed by the system. We should dismantle it. And I'm a big fan of Cape Por Diego. They funded some of my research back in the day, and I worked with Lily and Allison on many, amazing opportunities to support people of color in this space. And I love their Leahy Tech pipeline. I think it's a great way to think about intersectionality and disparities within these systems that we're building for an automated future. You see, I didn't mention anything. My two amazing brethren, if those are the pronouns you go by, so forgive me for saying that if you don't. I have no fight in this moment to push people to understand that piece of the world until we can level the playing field for broadband. I think we have amazing organizations doing that work, but I think the main work, at least on the ground, is educating people about these dollars that are coming into cities and how they should steer those dollars and how they should develop their own inclusive and diverse task force to hold states and municipalities accountable for what their cities need. And so for me, when I think about digital discrimination, I see it as you got to write it in such a way that you can get the utmost good and hold the many actors, right? Whether they're conscious of it or unconscious of it, accountable for how they treat and disrespect and silence and alienate and create objects, right, of people of color in this country.
Wow, that was really powerful, Dr. Olson. Thank you so much for sharing. And it seems like a great transition to Diego to talk a little bit more about this issue.
Thank you, Emily. So just to add to what Dr. Fallon and Brandon already said, one of the main aspects we normally focus on in our research projects is the education piece and how many jobs have increasingly required 4-year college degrees without really needing those skills that are taught through the 4-year college degree for the kind of skills required for that position, and how this has become like an additional barrier to many Latino workers to access high quality jobs. And we really respect the job that an organization such as Digital Nest is doing in California, where they are working with high school students to provide them digital upskilling. And then they work with them as consultants to provide digital marketing services to small businesses in the neighborhood that normally wouldn't be able to pay for those, in order for them to develop their website presence, their e-commerce platform presence, or brand development. And then these high school students then have a relevant job experience that they can put in their resume, and they can transition into jobs in the tech sector without the need of going through a 4-year college degree that is highly expensive and adds to the debts that households already have. So it's also an issue to bear in mind. We also respect the work that Austin Community College is currently doing around this topic. They developed the Digital Fluency for Today's Jobs initiative. Basically consists of a platform for digital upskilling, not only of their students at the community college, but also in the community, in the broader community as a whole. And through micro-credentials, they are providing the digital skill training that many people need in order to succeed at their jobs or as entrepreneurs. So it is very important to look at these experiences and how alternative pathways to education can also be a solution to ensure higher equity in the space.
Thank you so much, Diego, and all of you for not only just being here today and giving us really incredible learnings from this conversation, but for all of the work that you are doing each and every day to lift our communities up and to correct some of these historical wrongs and make sure that these opportunities are available to all of us. So in closing, love to go around and ask all of you, we have a variety of folks tuning in today to listen to this conversation, but what is one thing that you'd like them to take away, or if they want to get more involved or want to learn more, what's something that they can do? So first we'll start with Dr. Fallon, if you don't mind putting some closing remarks.
First of all, thanks again for having me. Once again, we work with African-American churches from across the country. We work with them on educating them about originally the emergency broadband benefit, then the affordable connectivity program. I tell you the naming of these things. It's funny. I laugh as a person who understands the world. My church leader was like, these names are so cumbersome. I said, I know. It would help if the FCC and Congress had a PR branding strategist, UX team, like that digital services that they once had under President Obama would help with some of this. But I would simply say to get more involved in the work that we're doing, you can go to www.blackchurchesfordigitalequity.com, and there you can learn about the work that we're doing nationally and locally. I would also say, tune into our FCC diversity and equity meetings. I always mess that name up too. Hold on, what is it called? I wrote it down, Communications and Equity Committee. Because we need more eyes and thoughts and support. And I suspect that a lot of those organizations that are members of this committee will be reaching out to amazing folk like Brandon and Diego to be thought leaders as we talk about digital discrimination and other forms of things that we need rulemaking on, right? And lastly, I would say, hold Southern states accountable. And northern states and western and east. I'm not calling them out, but southern states have such a special place in my heart. And we need to make sure that they have the resources that they need to ensure, at least for the majority of African-American people that live in southern states, that they have the resources needed that are coming down from the infrastructure bill and digital equity dollars.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. I'll pass it to Brandon.
I guess closing thoughts I want to leave folks with is that the digital divide is not just about faster speeds and lower prices. That is a part of it, but we have to think much further than that. And we have to think much further than just devices and digital literacy also. Digital literacy is a mitigation tactic for these environments which are inherently unsafe and insecure, trying to teach people how to navigate them. We need to take ownership so that we can actually make sure that we're building out communities that are safe and secure for our people. We don't need better locks. We need better communities. And then the last thing I'll say is that, I've spent a lot of my capacity working with folks like Emily on trying to make sure that the emergency broadband benefit existed and led to an affordable connectivity program. I also have mixed feelings about creating a subsidy that's going in to fund these providers that have created the digital divide. But this is the last thought I'll leave you with is really, if you're in a community and you're working with people and you're a trusted messenger, help people sign up for that, because we need to get whatever we can by any means necessary for our people. And so don't be shy about it. I know that there's mistrust of these providers and of the government and of government programs, but it's a really important thing. And so although it's not just about lower prices and faster speeds, if we can help knock down that price of that unaffordable internet for folks, we should do that really important work too.
All right. Thank you, Brandon, for all the work you continue to do on that front. Diego?
Thank you. So to anyone who is interested in learning more about our work, I encourage you to visit our website. We have both in-person and virtual events very often, bringing in specialists and experts on Latino business and entrepreneurship development, on Latino digital inclusion and success. So you're more than welcome to join in. We also have all our reports and articles posted on our website. And just as a closing remark or thought, just to align with Brandon and Dr. Fallon in how important it is to think about this topic from an intersectionality lens. And in the case of the Latino community, as I said before, it's an incredibly heterogeneous and rich community, culturally rich community. So it's important to understand also how this is impacting Latina women, Afro-Latinos, Indigenous Latinos, and sometimes there is like very insufficient information disaggregated within the Latino community. So it's important to improve data availability. And in this sense, we are starting a new project that involves case studies in each of the cities where we are currently working with our City Learning and Action Lab to understand the nuances and how the digitalization of the economy is impacting different economic structures and different Latino communities around the country. So basically that, thank you again for the opportunity. And it's been a pleasure to share this panel with Brandon and Dr. Fallon as well. Thank you, Emily.
Yes, thank you to each of you again. And I hope that those who are tuning in will make sure that they follow all of the organizations and all three of these individuals, because they're people who, just beyond their day-to-day jobs are doing tremendous work for our communities and are really leading us in this space. So I really encourage you all to continue following the work of all three of our panelists. Before ending our conversation today, I'd like to invite everyone to continue the conversation on Twitter. You can use the event hashtag DIS22 and Digital Breakthrough. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you again to our three phenomenal panelists for joining us, for educating us, and doing this really, really difficult, but absolutely critical work on the ground. We appreciate you, admire you, and like you all. Thank you so much.
Most Americans think about the digital divide as the disparity between those who benefit from the internet and digital technologies and those who don't.
Families who are living in poverty, they don't have access to the same tools and resources that others do. So they're disconnected from what's happening in the community. Family Gateway was started as a response to a population that we don't typically think about when we think about homelessness, and that's families with children. So here at the Family Gateway shelter, they will use these wonderful computers for education, for jobs, for looking for housing. They'll use the computers to connect to the outside world.
There's a lot to be excited about when we open up these centers. And I know that inside of that excitement is the opportunity for them to grow, achieve their educational ambitions, and then be a productive part of society.
My name is Amy Hinojosa, and I'm the president and CEO of MANA, a national Latina organization. MANA is a national grassroots membership organization with chapters, individual members, and affiliates across the country. MANA contributes the leading Latina voice on many of the major issues in the public sphere, particularly in the areas of education and tech access, health equity, financial literacy, equal and civil rights, and immigration reform. Chapters and affiliates provide programming locally to educate and empower our communities nationwide. Our mission and values are rooted in serving the community through leadership development, community service, educational workshops, mentoring the next generation of leaders, and building the structures to support continued Latina success. As someone who grew up in rural Texas, I'm all too familiar with the challenges associated with rural access and adoption. And those challenges have only magnified as a result of the pandemic and the absolute need for youth and families to be connected to work, school, health, and other critical information. We're honored to have Adael Casperalta, Senior Policy Advisor at USDA, to talk about how the Biden administration is tackling these challenges and how community-serving organizations can access the resources available to meet those needs. And stay tuned afterward for a very special fireside chat with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr and Native American leader Godfrey Njadi.
Hello, HTTP Digital Inclusion Summit. It's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Adael Casaperalta, and I am a Senior Policy Advisor at the Rural Utility Service in the Department of Agriculture. The Rural Utility Service provides funding to entities that step up to offer basic infrastructure services to rural communities. We offer loans and grants to fund water, electric, and broadband service in rural areas. And we partner with private rural carriers, nonprofits, tribes, cooperatives, and municipalities. We have 4 different programs focused on expanding broadband service and 1 program focused on equipment for telemedicine and distance learning. I want to highlight our Reconnect program, which funds broadband infrastructure. In the 3rd round of the program, which just closed, we offered over $1 billion in funding with $700 million in grants alone. Reconnect received almost $2 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law to continue to help close the digital divide. Please reach out to RUS to learn more about upcoming Reconnect funding rounds and other funding opportunities. Also, RUS has telecommunications general field representatives in each state that can help guide you through our programs and funding applications. We've provided HTTP with links for more information. Thank you for your leadership in closing the digital divide and ensuring rural communities are connected.
Thank you so much to HTTP for the opportunity to join you for this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. It's a tremendous honor for me, and I'm great to be joined here with my good friend Godfrey. I'll introduce him shortly in more detail, hopefully. This is a real opportune time for us to be discussing digital inclusion. Those of us that work at the FCC, those that are put their life's blood, sweat, and tears into building out internet connections like Godfrey have been committed to this cause for a very, very long time. But I think for the first time in history, we have the federal dollars and the federal backing to truly and finally fully bridge the digital divide. So for my part, I want to introduce myself. I'm Brendan Carr. I'm one of the commissioners at the Federal Communications Commission. I've been there since 2017 as a commissioner and earlier started at the FCC as a staffer back in 2012. So I'm almost a lifer now, been there for about 10 years. And the reality is, the story of bridging the digital divide is a mixed one. There's a lot of communities where we've made tremendous progress. We're getting high-speed fiber built out, new connections built out, and that is a really, really good thing to see. At the same time, if your community is down the street or on the other side of a county from where that progress is being made, then it means very little to you that work is going on. And so we're not at a situation where we're raising the mission accomplished flag by any stretch of the imagination. But we do have some really good initiatives underway that I wanted to bring to your attention. One is we've really engaged in unprecedented work in the last year to address the affordability portion of the digital divide. After all, there's many components of the digital divide. One is access to infrastructure. Another is affordability. There's a whole other set of issues of making sure that people understand what the internet means to their daily life, and so that they actually take the time to get onto the internet and realize the benefits. So we've got a new range of low-income programs. It started as an emergency broadband benefit program. It's now an ACP program, which provides a pretty substantial discount on monthly internet service for a broad range of low-income families. We want to be sure to spread the word about ACP, get people enrolled in that program, signed up for the program. It also can come with a one-time stipend funding to get a connected device as well. So I'm really proud of the work that the FCC has done standing up. The reality is we've had low-income programs for a while, including Lifeline, which has done some good work. But the truth is the relatively low $9 subsidy of Lifeline wasn't really giving people that great of a program. And so the additional funding that we have from ACP, the additional discount, I think and I hope is getting people much more robust service. So that's some of the work that we're doing at the FCC. We got to continue to get more spectrum out there. in order to make sure that providers have the airwaves that they need to connect communities. We've got to make it easier to build internet infrastructure. We've got to be addressing this low income issue. More broadly, when you look at hundreds of billions of dollars that have been made available for internet infrastructure, we have to make sure that we prioritize the communities that have nothing today, that have 0 megabits per second. It's great to get people a second, a third, a fourth high-speed internet option. I want to see that happen. But when we have these limited federal dollars, we need to put those dollars in the communities that are still stuck on the wrong side of the digital divide. We have money left over. We can then talk about helping to get additional competition in existing areas, but we need to coalesce as a policy matter around driving those dollars to the truly unconnected, because we have a unique opportunity. If we get the right policies in place, truly, we have the dollars at this point to end the digital divide, and shame on us if we don't do the work necessary to make that happen. In my time on the FCC, I've tried to spend a lot of time outside of DC. I think there's no better way to understand the challenge than doing that. I've been to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation and seen firsthand some of the fiber that's getting built out there. I've been to the Coeur d'Alene Indian Reservation, met with tribal leaders there, specifically to talk about the ACP program and make sure that we're making it easy for people to get involved. And I've been to the Mescalero Apache Reservation with Godfrey and learned a lot on that visit. When we talk generally about the work we need to do to bridge the digital divide, that is nowhere more important than when it comes to tribal lands. That's a place where, frankly, we're just too far behind, even remote, rural, and other parts of the geographies. Tribal is too far behind. So I hope that we're making some progress there. And with that, I want to turn it over to Godfrey. As I mentioned, I first met Godfrey on various, tribal meetings that we've held together, but got a chance to spend time with him in his community in New Mexico, and got to see how beloved he is in that community. And I think it's more than just the fact that he brings internet connectivity to people. I think the type of person he is part of why he's such a beloved member of that community. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Godfrey to offer a couple remarks, then we can have a bit of a back and forth.
Commissioner Carr, you're too kind. Let me tell you, it's been a pleasure working with you and the rest of the commissioners, especially in DC, when we come out to talk to you guys and be able to make at least let you know what's happening in any country. Digital inclusion is one of the things that's dear to our hearts. I guess that's a newer name for the digital divide for any country. I guess that's one of the things that you can look at. But for myself, I've been at Maddie for 21 years. We've been in existence for that long of a time. I come from the industry. I came from a company called Contel, GTE, and then Verizon. So that's where my roots are. So I've been working and came back to the reservation to help build a company. We're a little bit ahead of the game, especially for tribal telcos. We're a little bit ahead of the game. So we've had broadband available for the community for quite a long time. But digital inclusion, getting everybody on the same page has been tough. Let me tell you, that's one of the things that has been tough for a lot of nations, especially leadership on tribal nations, trying to figure out how to best use all this new angled technology that they claim it is. So that's one of my jobs there on the Mescalero Apache reservations. You got to come out and see it. We're more ahead of the game, especially when you were there to see the telemedicine that was being used, pretty much all the other inclusion. Digital equity is another one that needs to be developed more for any country. So that's just kind of who I am, and we can go from there, Commissioner.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much, Godfrey. One of the things I wanted to pause and touch on that you mentioned was telehealth. As you mentioned, when I was out there with you, I had the chance to visit the Mescalero Indian Hospital. And one of the things that I found there was that this high-speed internet connection that came to the Mescalero Indian Hospital allowed the generalists that are located there to have a direct video connection with specialists located all the way back in Albuquerque. And what's so interesting is, look, we got a problem in this country. We have a lot of problems. We have at least one problem in this country in terms of the lack of specialists and healthcare providers in rural, remote areas, Indian country. And so when you have this video connection, you can get, a real-time interaction with a specialist that, that again, can be hundreds of miles away. Maybe talk a bit more about, what you've seen from telehealth. I think particularly with COVID-19, we've just seen a massive spike in telehealth usage, but maybe sort of talk about what you think a high-speed connection means in terms of equal access to quality healthcare.
Yes, Commissioner, that is one of the things that is very much needed. In fact, we just gave them half a gigabyte of connection again at the hospital. That just happened in the last few weeks. As they need more, we will give them more, actually, whatever they need. This is something that's new for them. The Indian health hospitals across the nation don't have that kind of access everywhere. So as soon as we get that, more services are available to tribal members. And that's one of the things that's key and important, especially through this pandemic when we've been isolated so much. A lot is needed, especially when you saw that, the specialists that were there to talk through a lot of people's problems, being able to having not to go out there and travel from Albuquerque. It's about 210 miles. So a round trip in one day to go there, that you lose almost over half a day just trying to take care of one patient. But if they're able to do that throughout the state of New Mexico, they could do quite a few things and they have a full roster of patients they can work with rather than having to travel that distance, having to take somebody to Albuquerque. It's not feasible. So in this importance of having broadband available for a lot of these tribal nations, for us, hopefully broadband mapping will help as the FCC's new broadband map that comes out later this year or early next year will help out to see where that kind of services are needed mostly, critical services that are needed for tribes right now to do that on that side. So that's one of the things I'd like to see happen in the future when we hopefully identify and then we can put those dollars there to best use.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned again, the how it's basically impossible to travel the hundreds of miles to get specialist care, either financially or just transportation in the winter. It can be very difficult. And also there's a cultural element there. I mean, I remember being up in Utqiagvik, Alaska, the most northernmost community in the country, and their small airport there. And I was just sort of chatting up different people that I met in the small airport there. And I was talking to one woman about what we were doing there and the FCC and our support for telehealth. And she said, you have no idea what it means culturally for us to be able to stay in our home communities, get telehealth care, rather than having to fly to Anchorage and be separated from our community, separated from our families and the trauma that can be involved by doing that. So there's so many elements as to why I think telehealth is so important, why we got to keep the gains that we saw over COVID-19 going, so we don't go back to the way it was, where we had a lot of red tape and licensing and reimbursement problems with telehealth. So I do hope that Congress passes some legislation that makes some of the reforms that we've seen in the past year permanent. The other issue that I saw with you and many other places is we had a chance to visit the Mescalero Apache School, and they also had gotten a high-speed internet connection. When we were there, you took me around to some of the classrooms, and we got to talk with some of the students there. I remember there was one in particular that stood out to me, a young woman named Lana, and she had learned through the internet and through the lessons that she could download through that internet connection how to code. And she showed me basically a little mini robot that she coded herself. And it's such a heartening thing to see, is that power of a connection helping to bring a STEM education into the Mescalero Apache School, and a young woman who clearly had an instinct for this, a desire to do it, and the opportunity to pursue that type of STEM career, or at least get a base foundation that she could potentially build on down the road, was enabled by the power of a connection. So I do think internet connections to schools, to libraries, is an important component of what we're doing. Maybe you can talk some about that too.
Sure. Commissioner Carr, I appreciate that comments. That is something that is dear to our hearts. I think that's the start of digital equity, to making sure that we have all the tools that are needed for our children to make sure that they can be who they want to be, especially in those STEM programs. As we open that up and enrich our children to make sure that's a part of it. The other part of that too is our culture. We want to make sure that we don't lose our culture. We want to be able to utilize all this new technology to be able to preserve it and keep moving it forward while we learn everything else, all these other different aspects of technology that can be learned by our children. Those are some of the things. So there's going to be a little bit of a give and take to do that, to preserve that, but also we want to be the best that we can. This is something that's new, that's coming to Indian country, where we're able to work with these STEM programs, to be able to get the technology there for the interconnection, but also to be able to go to world-class scientists around the world, to be able to interact with our children, to be able to talk to them about what can be realized. This is something that's enriching a lot of our children to be able to excel and to be not staying in one place. So the world has come to Mescalero through the connection of the internet to be able to provide that kind of world-class education that we all deserve and need. So hopefully all of Indian country can take advantage of that, especially with the new dollars that are coming to Indian country, to be able to realize that, to form a plan, to be able to take advantage of this to best use and need. All tribes are sovereign, so we can't cookie cutter this, but it has to be developed locally all across the nation.
Yeah, and the other issue, obviously, that we've talked about is the economic opportunity, the jobs opportunity that comes from a connection. And I've focused not just on, the application layer, the ability of people to do their jobs remotely, but even the jobs that come from building out these networks. I've focused a lot on, for instance, the tower climbers, the fiber splicers. And the reality is we are way short on this country in terms of the workforce that we need to complete, whether it's our 5G build or our wired builds, and let alone when we've got these hundreds of billions of dollars coming down the pipe for infrastructure builds, we're going to have more money in more ability to fund projects than we are going to have a workforce in place to actually complete those projects. One thing I've been trying to do is look to community colleges and other ways of creating on-ramps into this industry, whether it's for tower climbers, where we've got to add about 27,000, or fiber splicers. Maybe talk a little bit about, do you have, challenges at your business with filling those roles? Do you see, ways that we can do a better job of attracting people into the workforce of actually building out these networks?
Commissioner Carr, thank you for that question. I believe workforce development is one of the key elements of to be successful in building out your own ISP or telecom. One of the key things that's needed there is sustainability funding for the operation to be able to put those dollars into the workforce and be able to develop it to what you need. There's going to be so many needs, not just tower climbers and splicers, but also IT development, especially maintaining the network, making sure that all the elements of the network are working properly, making sure that we're secure. Cybersecurity is one of the major things that could take us down, and we stay right on top of that to maintain that. But it takes dollars to train these people and to make sure that the networks are going. One of the first things when I started was to be able to enlist people from the industry that have retired to mentor a lot of our people here in Mescalero as we first got started. That kind of helped us hit the ground running, and we're able to get things going. But at the same time, on-the-job training was one of the things that kind of helped us out to be able to get this thing going at the very beginning. I don't know if that concept can still work today, but hopefully it can if we can get some retired people that would help out our tribal nations. That portion of workforce is needed. Like you said, thousands and the thousands of people that need to maintain these networks. A lot has to be done there. But hopefully through sustainability funding, where tribes can rely on that. A lot of tribes are not very rich. We all don't have casinos. We all don't have whatever it is that brings in the funds. So they're trying to use their general funds to try to pay for a lot of this. But if they can get relief through USF or congressional appropriations, that's one of the ways that we can help out and make sure that we ensure that all the dollars that were invested on tribes to build out their networks, that it stays intact and keeps moving forward for the benefit of all tribal nation people.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe switching gears some to the policy side. I talked a little bit about this at the open, but we do have this influx of dollars that are going to come to the state level, to the tribal level. And from my perspective, there's some mixed news there. I think at the federal level, I would have liked a little bit more guardrails on those dollars to make sure that they're going to the completely unserved areas, because it allows them to be used to overbuild existing networks. And we can have a whole debate about whether that's good policy or bad policy. I tend to think it's not good policy. But maybe from your perspective as well, are there any sort of rules of the road, guardrails, or how you're going to approach the influx of these dollars and how you think the government should prioritize? For instance, there's a little bit of a debate about, do you go, 100% fiber, or do you leave room for fixed wireless, for instance? And I tend to think that we need to leave at least a little room for fixed wireless, in part because of the time component, which is to say, basically over a weekend or a week or so, you can put up a new fixed wireless site and effectively serve, hundreds of families with pretty good high-speed service, versus building fiber to all those families could potentially be a years-long endeavor. Now, of course, we want to get fiber out everywhere we want to go, but I was up in North Idaho and saw that basically over the weekend they put a fixed wireless connection up and got high-speed service to people, and it would have been a multi-year process to get fiber. So I do think that we got to be balancing the idea that, yeah, fiber is a gold standard. Let's put it everywhere we can, but we can't leave people on the wrong side of the digital divide, for too long, waiting for that fiber. And maybe fixed wireless can be something in the interim at a minimum. I don't know if you have thoughts about that or other sort of policy ideas as we look at trying to implement these federal dollars.
Commissioner Carr, thank you for that question too. That is something that's needed. Especially, I'm appreciative for your support for the spectrum that any country received, the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum. A lot of people have utilized it and put it to work. But I believe in order to meet some of the higher demands for speed, I think more spectrum needs to be available for tribes to be able to use in that realm. So to meet some of those needs, I think it can happen. Fixed wireless is something that's it still is in infancy, but it's really garnering good numbers. The latency portion of it can be improved a little bit, but I think it's coming down the road. I think everything's going to work out eventually for the good of Indian country. There's so much new technology that's coming out that's needed for that. But in order to be able to preserve the dollars, to make sure, again, I still have to go back to sustainability. That's one thing that tribes are going to be needing eventually down the future. It's like getting a Cadillac Escalade, but giving you no gas money, no money for oil. And if you're a poor tribe, I mean, you're just not going to have nothing to run that vehicle with. It looks nice and shiny, but if you don't have all the things that make it work, it's kind of useless. So we have to ensure this as we keep moving forward. So hopefully we can get that done.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things that I learned in this job that I really didn't see intuitively was that the ongoing operating expenses of these networks is far, far higher relative to the initial CapEx investment that I would have thought before sort of getting under the hood here. That does raise a good question of how do we sustain this financially. A lot of people say, well, look, we got hundreds of billions of dollars. We're going to be fine. But to your point, we got to figure out what comes next. Because yes, we have a lot of money right now. We've got $24 billion over the last year for low income, but we are going to run out of that $24 billion at some point. We got to figure out what comes next. One idea that I've tossed out there is this concept of fair share, which basically looks to the large technology companies that drive, the vast majority of internet traffic and that realize trillions of dollars of benefits from it, and put them to start contributing a fair share, not just for the networks potentially, but also for these, programs that are used to support low-income Americans and their ability to access the internet. So that's an idea that I have thrown out there in terms of looking at a way that we sustain this long-term. Because, yeah, $24 billion is a lot. It might take a year or a couple of years to get through it, but we are going to get through it, and we got to make sure that there's something on the other side. Maybe finally, a last round of back and forth a little bit here. Talk some about maybe digital skills, relevancy of the internet. Is that a challenge that you see, that you can get it affordable, you can get the access? Do you still see hesitance towards getting online, using the internet frequently, or do you think that we've made progress, that people get it, or are there ways that you think we can overcome some of the hesitancy to get more engaged in sort of the digital world?
Well, I never thought I'd say this, Commissioner Carr, but I have become an elder here pretty soon in our tribe. But a lot of people on reservations that just don't understand how a lot of the notebooks, iPads, or anything like that works, they're going to be left behind. And if we can work through the elderly centers, the libraries, to help teach and offer classes on how to work with this, how to get online, just to check on your Social Security. That's still a thing that needs to work out in any country. A lot of this new technology is going to be coming fast, and it's going to hit hard. Within the next 5 years, tribes have to really catch up and try to work on that solution of how to get everybody online. it's going to be a problem. It's going to be tough, and there's going to be a lot of people that don't want to be a part of it. But it is something that in order to just check anything on the internet, to be able to check on your benefits that might be going forward, you're going to need to get online somehow, in some way. Whether you need help with somebody to do that, or you have the means of getting some kind of a laptop or whatever else, and there's money available for that. But again, there's a learning curve here. So somebody's got to take you step by step through that whole process, how to get that done. Once they feel comfortable, and I think it's going to really open up a lot of eyes and help a lot of people as we keep moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's a lot of these decisions made back here where I am in Washington assume that everybody has the same access to internet connectivity that exists inside the Beltway, outside the Beltway, and that's not true. So your point, we have medical records that, we need to get online, Social Security benefits, as you mentioned. There's a lot of stuff that's moving digital only, which is great if you have affordable access, but it's a real problem and challenge. So that's why we got to just put the pedal down and make sure we do the good work here to fully and finally end the digital divide. Like I said, I think we got the federal dollars to do it if we get the right policies in place. So for my part, Godfrey, I want to thank you, my good friend, again, for the chance to do this. I really enjoyed the chance to get out of DC to join you at the Mescalero Apache and to see you. We did a virtual event a couple weeks ago when I was in Albuquerque. So it was good to connect with you there. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work to implement these dollars in a way that's going to make a difference. Godfrey, I don't know if you have any last words that you want to make as well.
I do. I think one of the things that we kind of touched on it, but I think it's something that needs a little bit more discovery is the mapping. That's one key thing that I saw that the state of New Mexico, they're really working hard to try to get that reinforced in ways where we're down to the county level now, and we're able to get where the county is a part and buy into the fact of information that's needed. They've been going out and garnering information, going to houses, taking GPS hits to be able to include that into the mapping kind of households. It's a little bit better than I've seen anywhere. So the state of New Mexico Do-It programs, mapping service, has really done a lot to be able to try to see where broadbands are not, where it's not available. And in the colonias, they have a lot of different areas, land grant areas. Those are some of the places that I've been trying to work on in the mapping portion of it. So I hope the FCC's mapping will include a lot of that kind of information, be able to go at that granular level, to be able to see what's going on. So we can make sure, to make sure those dollars are getting used in the areas that is needed the most.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. We've had these maps at the federal level, these broadband maps at the FCC, which frankly were just terrible. I mean, they were okay when they started, but they just weren't fit for the purpose that we ended up relying for them on, which is where is there affordable or at least quality high-speed internet, where is there not? We got an influx of funds from Congress right around January 2021 to get those maps done. We're still working on them, but we got to just accelerate our work on that, because when we get those accurate, new, updated maps in place, to your point, that's going to identify the areas that have internet, those that don't. And then that's going to be the key information for driving this funding. So I think we got to be very careful spending these broadband dollars before those maps are done, because we could err on the side of, inadvertently sending those dollars to places that already have service. So for my part, we want to thank HTTP again for the chance to join you at the Digital Inclusion Summit. Appreciate the chance to connect with Godfrey, and we're going to keep working until we, get this job done of bridging the digital divide. So thank you so much.
Hello again. As we have heard today, achieving our digital and universal access goals, along with affordability and adoption, requires being thoughtful. It requires being intentional, and it requires collaborative action from private industry, civil society, regulators, and policymakers on both sides of the aisle. This is especially important in rural and historically unserved communities across the United States. Please join me in Representative John Curtis, who has been advocating for more public and private investment to upgrade infrastructure deployments and boost competition and assist in closing the digital divide in both rural and urban areas.
Hi, I'm Congressman John Curtis, and I'm really pleased to take a moment as part of the Digital Inclusion Summit I'm coming to you from my home in Provo, Utah, where we all enjoy access to gig speed or sometimes even better at very reasonable prices. But my district stretches all the way down to the Four Corners region of Utah. And I have portions of my region, of my district, that actually don't even have running water or electricity. You can imagine the challenge of getting internet service into these locations. I'm so pleased that Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has acknowledged the importance of this. At the same time, I realized that Congress doesn't even understand the difficulties of reaching some of the parts of my district and have made it difficult with some of our procedures. And it's, for instance, difficult to permit across public lands. So I join you in the goal of getting to everybody across this great country and giving them good access to internet. It's so important for education, for healthcare, for business, and sure appreciate everybody's efforts. Best to all of you.
How good are you at spotting fake news or seeking out accurate, relevant, and trustworthy information? This is actually a really important skill for the future of work. It's called digital discernment. As we spend more of our time in digital spaces and start working more closely with technologies such as artificial intelligence, the amount of digital data and information that's going to be thrown at us is only going to increase. So being able to seek out reliable and verified information is going to become even more important. So here's what digital discernment skills look like in practice. Comparing how headlines differed from two different media sources. Checking the sources of information. For example, was this just written on social media so it doesn't have any editorial standards? Or asking questions like, is there a reason why an algorithm fed me this piece of information in particular? Digital discernment is a key skill for the future of work, and I'm going to continue to share more on skills for the future.
Afternoon, and thank you, HTTP, for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. It is an honor for LULAC to serve as a founder and to have the pleasure to serve as a board member. The digital era has become the new face of inequity through the underrepresentation of communities of color and the lack of access to resources. Tech professionals of color make up less than 5% of the workforce at major tech companies, while most people who lack access to broadband live in rural, remote, low-income, and tribal lands. For instance, nearly 30% of Latino families don't have at-home internet service. This is the sad reality of today, and this is the reality that we at LULAC are fighting to amend. I recently met with mainstream media executives urging for greater on-screen representation of Latinos. Representation matters. We need the diversity in our newsroom, on the air, on our apps, in our C-suites and boardrooms to match the diversity of our country. We've made it LULAC's priority to fight for equal access to broadband and tech equipment. And we've been following congressional relief funding really closely. Through the Affordable Connectivity Program, households can qualify for subsidized broadband support, but many in our communities are unaware of the benefits or how to apply. As the oldest and largest national Latino grassroots advocacy organization, our goal is to serve as an educational resource to push enrollment and build overall trust. Now, more than 10 million households are enrolled in the program. But I urge everyone here to spread the word even further to ensure no one in our communities is left behind. Today, I have the honor of introducing one of the senators behind the push for equal digital access, nuestro senador, Alex Padilla. Senador Alex Padilla hasn't been in federal office for long, but his impact has already been felt. He's made history as the first Latino to represent California in the US Senate, and he's helped countless families by advocating and delivering equitable relief after COVID, and to push the federal government for more equity in STEM education. As an engineer, Senator Padilla understands that access to broadband is essential infrastructure, and he followed through by ensuring Californian schools and libraries could get their students and staff online during the pandemic. As a son of immigrants, he has dedicated his career to supporting communities often left behind. And he's fighting to ensure everyone has a fair shot at the American dream. Please join me in welcoming a friend and ally of LULAC and nuestra comunidad, el Senador Alex Padilla.
Hi, I'm Alex Padilla, and I have the honor of representing California in the United States Senate. As an engineer by training, I know how much technology shapes our lives, and yet STEM fields have a long way to go to better support diverse workers and more inclusive design. That's why I'm supporting a government-wide push to increase equity in STEM education. I've advocated for funding to improve STEM programs at Hispanic-serving institutions and build new partnerships between top research universities and minority-serving institutions. A more diverse STEM pipeline is key to maintaining America's leadership in innovation. I'm also proud to support the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to broadband for all. As the COVID-19 pandemic made clear, broadband is essential infrastructure. Businesses, workers, and students all know that a reliable high-speed internet connection is just as necessary as safe roads and bridges. But communities of color throughout the country face large disparities in broadband access. In California, we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that there's equitable access to broadband. We've come a long way since I first wrote the bill creating the California Advanced Services Fund in 2008 and expanded it in 2010 and 2013. Now that legislation has funded hundreds of millions of dollars in grants and loans to support broadband across the state, especially in unserved and underserved areas. I championed those bills because of a 2008 report showing that 1.4 million Californians lacked access to broadband, and half of California residents only subscribe to low-speed dial-up internet. Today, the share of Californians with high-speed internet at home has risen dramatically. But broadband access and adoption still remains lower for Black and Latino households and tribal communities. I'm proud to have voted for the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law, which are enabling the federal government to invest in bridging this divide. As we plan for the future of our economy, we need to go even further to build an inclusive digital future. And we need your voices to help create media and technology sectors that reflect and respond to the diversity of our nation. I want to thank the Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership for inviting me to join you today. I look forward to hearing the bold ideas that no doubt will come out of this summit.
Hola, mi gente. My name is Zachary Ryan, and I am the co-founder of Netha Collab, a digital advocacy and marketing firm dedicated to social justice. I'm really excited for our chat today. Make sure that you join the conversation on Twitter. Use the event hashtag DIS22, and make sure you tag HTTP policy. So, as someone who is a part of the civil rights policy ecosystem, I am continuously fascinated with the interconnectedness of the values and movements that mean the most to us and the power of our communities. We often don't see, though, what is the missing link there is the knowledge of policies and laws that affect our day-to-day lives. It's a personal passion of mine to help bring policy to the people and meet the communities we belong to where we are already at. And so luckily, the internet has made policy more accessible and on good days, even trendy. While, at its inception, the internet was an on-ramp to equity for many historically and intentionally marginalized communities, today it can be used as a tool of oppression. From disinformation campaigns that build on hate to target us, to algorithmic bias that intentionally is built to amplify some voices over others, there are a number of things to be concerned about in today's online world. And so part of what we will be discussing today is a law called Section 230. Section 230 was created in 1997 to give website owners the legal ability to moderate their own content. Essentially, this legally shields websites if one of their users posts something illegal. And now for some, this law is seen as an important tool for allowing speech from diverse groups of people to thrive online. But for others, this law is outdated and needs to be strengthened for civil rights protections. While there are some exceptions to Section 230 for copyright infringement and some sex work-related materials, the law has largely stayed the same since its inception in 1996, a time where we didn't even know what social media was, let alone what the social media landscape would look like today. And so with that, I'm very excited to welcome Rashad Robinson, the president of Color of Change, to chat with us today about Section 230 and its impact on our communities. Now, under Rashad's leadership, Color of Change designs and implements winning strategies for racial justice. Rashad, you and I have worked in the same field for a long time, and so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to chat with you one-on-one and with all of our virtual viewers, of course.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you, and thank you for your work.
Of course, thank you. So I think let's go ahead and jump right in. We often talk about the internet as a magical place that gives over storytelling and money-making power to historically and intentionally marginalized people. But that really assumes that the internet is equally and equally accessible to everyone. But you and I both know that that is just not how the internet is set up today. Unfortunately, between paid media, hate and violence online that spills over into our real lives, and platforms' lack of regulation, what are some things that concern you about this kind of dominance from platforms like Meta, aka Facebook? And what challenges do BIPOC creators and users face online today?
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to look at these platforms the way we look at all the different platforms that give us the ability to reach people. Just the other night, I watched this TV show on ABC called Abbott Elementary. Actually, it's an ABC show I watched on Hulu. I love this show. It's giving a young Black woman the ability to tell stories about a West Philadelphia public school, sort of the intersections of race and class and education, all these things. And it's happening on TV, and it's also on these platforms, streaming platforms. And that doesn't mean that everything else on TV is great. It doesn't mean that TV doesn't need rules and regulation to sort of govern the type of content that goes on there. And so what's happening right now is the technology that is supposed to bring us into the future is dragging us into the past. And it's because we have outdated rules on how these platforms should have to they get to hold themselves accountable. And self-regulated companies are unregulated companies. And that, I think, is the biggest sort of takeaway. It's that we actually need rules of the road to ensure that these companies do not continue to create harm. And harm ends up going downstream. So those that have less power in our society end up bearing the greatest brunt, while those with the greatest amount of power end up making the most money off of those harms created. And Section 230, which you just, brilliantly outlined, I think really is one of those key areas of a rule that needs updating to sort of meet the needs of the 21st century.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up Abbott Elementary, because that is my fiance and I's favorite show right now. So everyone watching, go watch it. It's hilarious. But that, I think, is a perfect segue into my next question for you. The audience heard my spiel on Section 230, but what's Color of Change's take on Section 230? Does it need to be amended, strengthened, left alone?
So I recently testified before Congress, along with Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, and I've also recently co-chaired the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, along with Chris Krebs and Katie Couric, along with 15 other commissioners from various walks of life, and who've been working on these issues, and really sort of looking at reforms that both deal with the importance of upholding the First Amendment, dealing with all the ways in which we need to make our voices heard, while also recognizing that these companies have business models that are actually causing harm that have nothing to do with the First Amendment. And so some of the reforms that we're actually really focusing on is really dealing with the business model. The fact of the matter is that that these companies are not just putting up content that other people are writing, they are making recommendations of who you should follow. They are prioritizing what type of content gets in front of you. They have a whole paid advertising program. And none of that should be immune from the type of accountability for the harm that it should be done. And we can create rules that do allow all of us as individuals to raise our voices. As a person who has sort of stood outside of some of these companies and sometimes been in the boardrooms with the CEOs, has force these companies to actually have to conduct racial equity audits, and then watch them as they did not implement racial equity, those sort of the recommendations of the racial equity audits. I recognize that we continue to sort of play this sort of circular dance with these companies where we're begging them to uphold rules of civil rights when we should never have to beg billionaires to actually have to sort of deal with the rule of law, that we actually have a government and the government needs to hold these companies accountable. And where rules need to be updated, we need to do that. And so the fight for folks of color, for Black and Brown communities in particular, to think about sort of all the ways in which these companies get to sort of dictate the demands. I think about Facebook, and over 80% of their moderators are English language moderators. And the rest of that is all the other languages globally. They have created such an opening for information disorder that we don't even know what's happening, and they don't know what's happening. But the communities that are actually getting the brunt of that information, it's impacting conversations and data about health, about education, about our democracy and how to vote. All of these things are under attack, and these platforms are raking in money and not being held accountable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think Congressman Tony Cardenas always says, right, we all have that one tia that just shares all of this stuff on Facebook, and we have to kind of rein it in. And I think that's, definitely to what you're saying of non-English content moderation is just falling through the cracks. Yeah. And so as we kind of talk about making sure that we're not just trusting these platforms to regulate themselves, aside from Section 230, are there any other tools in our tool belt that we can use to try and hold them accountable?
So I think about, the audience that we've got here. So we've got people who are probably connected to these platforms in some way, probably folks in government, people who have leadership roles throughout other aspects of society. And it's going to take all of society to deal with information disorder. Yes, there have to be new rules for the platforms, but we also have to have institutions that accredit our lawyers, our doctors, our educators, to hold those folks who might be moving and advancing misinformation and disinformation accountable. We need rules for the platforms about how they sort of prioritize and uplift the super spreaders on these platforms and deal with all the ways in which they remove sort of privileges from those folks. We have to, have rules and have sort of a look at the future, at sort of what are the investments that can be made in communities that have been deeply harmed by this information and disinformation. Though some of the ways in which cigarette companies had to sort of make real investments into those communities. And at a higher level, we have to deal with antitrust. We have to deal with the consolidation of big companies that are sort of in some ways that we have no ability to regulate them. But that's going to take leadership across all of these sectors. It's going to take leadership in government. It's going to take leadership in the platforms. It's going to take leadership in the private sector. And it's also going to take all of us to hold our elected leaders accountable. I oftentimes say this about where we're at in this moment in time, where we have, big unregulated companies that get to set their own rules. The reason why the meat is safe in our supermarkets, the reason why our seatbelts work in our cars is not because of the altruism of big agriculture and the food industry or the altruism of the auto industry. It's because of a set of rules and accountability on those industries to actually meet safety standards. And that happened because of movements of everyday people. So we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have the people lined up at the front door. Elevating this as a key issue and holding those in power accountable to actually do something. Far too often when we are working to sort of advance legislation or move legislation, the big platforms come in with their lobbyists, and they're always going to come in with more money, more resources, sort of a better story about what they maybe can do in the next election cycle. And so we're going to need more of us involved in prioritizing this issue. I always believe that the people facing money and power can always win, but the people have to have a strategy and the people have to be organized.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. And thank you for kind of naming that dynamic too. I think that's something we forget about, is that these are corporations, just like in any other industry, right, that have almost unlimited resources when it comes to kind of squashing what we take so long to build up on the social justice and movement side. And I think that's a great kind of segue into our wrap up here. I really want us to drive home the impact of this issue for our communities. Why should communities of color, why should Black and Brown folks care about disinformation and platform accountability? What does that translate to in their everyday lives? And then what can they do to get involved?
Well, information disorder, disinformation is a problem that impacts all other problems in society. When bad information outweighs good information, it creates consequences for our health, for our education, for our ability to express our will for a better future through our democracy. It impacts every aspect of life. And the impacts on communities that have been traditionally under attack, I don't want to call our communities vulnerable, because talking about our communities as vulnerable really removes what's actually been done to our communities. We're not vulnerable, we're not weak. We have been targeted, attacked, exploited. And so part of what we actually need to recognize here is that so many of the problems that exist in society are about the need for structural change. And what we're dealing with information disorder is not because Black and Brown communities are broken. It's because we have systems and structures which have been designed to harm us. This inequality that we are facing has been manufactured, and the problems that we are facing has been manufactured for profit. And we have to do the work to change the rules, to build new sets of power, and to translate that into the type of changes that our communities deserve. This is one of the key issues, civil rights issues of our time, because it will be hard to win on so many of the challenges we are facing if we are facing every single day an environment where the facts cannot actually beat the lies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm fired up. So I hope everyone in the audience is too. Thank you so much for that, Rashad. And thank you so much for being here today. This has really been, a truly important conversation. And I'm glad that we could share this time together. I'm really excited for the next talk as well. If you're in the audience, please stay on. My really good friend, KJ Bakshi, is going to dive into part 2 of this conversation.
Hey, everyone, and thanks to Daiquiri for that very fascinating conversation with Rashad. I think we definitely learned a lot, and I'm excited to talk with my colleague here today, Elizabeth, to kind of continue on the conversation on Section 230. But before jumping in, I definitely want to thank HTTP for hosting this summit and for allowing us to have this conversation today. My name's KJ Bagchi. I'm the Senior Director of Federal Public Policy at the Chamber of Progress. We're a new center-left tech trade association focused on technology's progressive future. Before we jump in to the conversation, I also wanted to give a little bit of background on my colleague, Elizabeth Banker, who's joining us. She has been working on Section 230 issues since the beginning, really, for about 25 plus years now. And she's been working on these issues from a variety of perspectives, including in companies like Yahoo and Twitter, where she worked on safety and content issues and was involved in the litigation of some key Section 230 cases. I'm very fortunate because I get to work with her more closely now that she's joined us at the Chamber of Progress as our Vice President of Legal Advocacy. I want to bring Elizabeth in, and just to start us off, can you, talk to us a little bit about why communities of color or other diverse communities should be paying attention to this conversation around Section 230?
Sure, KJ. The universe of people who depend on Section 230 is really broad, and it extends far beyond the tech companies that we usually talk about, whether it's local newspapers or community blogs, Wikipedia, online petition and online fundraising sites. I mean, the list kind of goes on. But what I want to highlight really is that Section 230 helps groups and individuals who want to speak out to create change. And we've seen Section 230 come up in cases involving things like the Plainview Project, which is designed to shine a light on racism in the police. We've seen it with environmental activists, organizing through things like Facebook pages, and material related to the Me Too movement.
So it's, what's always fascinated me about the conversation around Section 230 is that it is definitely it's codified law, but really when it's used on a day-to-day basis or in our courts, it actually functions as more of a procedural tool, right? Rather than some kind of blanket immunity that, a lot of sort of opponents and critics will talk about. They'll use this terminology, blanket immunity, but really it's a process tool. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Sure. I actually put out a paper in 2020 where I had done a review of about 500 decisions involving Section 230. And there were some really interesting findings, because I think when people, as you say, think about 230, they think about it just automatically stops cases in their tracks. And a few of the things that I found were that courts frequently dismiss lawsuits with that, even where 230 was brought up, without ever reaching the issue. So something like 25% of the cases I looked at, that's what happened, because there were legal flaws with the underlying claims. And so the court never had to get to 230. I think, a great example that often comes up as a reason for 230 reform are cases involving social media and allegations of material support of terrorism, where most of those cases were dismissed because of a lack of causation. And so I think that's one good example. I just want to say we also see courts scrutinize when providers and others assert Section 230 to see if it applies. There are exceptions for IP, things like FOSTA, and courts definitely will recognize when those exceptions apply and refuse to apply 230. So I think, that's important to know.
True. And it's also with Section 230, if it doesn't apply in a case, then whoever the defendant is, right? If it's a big tech company, a smaller company, whoever's applying it, they still have to proceed with the case, right? Like it's not the conversation about liability, is still pursued if Section 230 is not granted in that situation, right?
Absolutely. I think maybe I'll use an example. One of the cases that comes up all the time is the old Fair Housing Council versus roommates.com case, which related to housing discrimination. Roommates, and this was a very important case in the development of 230 jurisprudence, was denied Section 230 protection related to a questionnaire that they had developed where users just put in multiple choice answers because of their role in the development of the content, while they did receive 230 immunity for open text boxes. That case went on to be litigated, and ultimately the Ninth Circuit found that roommates didn't violate the fair housing laws. So, it's interesting. Every time I see that case talked about, it's always in the context, even in judicial opinions, of the illegal questionnaire that ultimately was determined by a court not to be illegal.
No, that is fascinating. And it definitely does come up a lot in discourse. The idea that if somehow, this actually leads to my next kind of question, that there's this sort of, misinformation about the idea that if Section 230 doesn't apply, then all of a sudden there's automatic liability. But from that example you're showing, it still gets litigated and those questions still can get answered. Nothing is guaranteed. And, so to that topic of this idea of trying to find ways to take away that 230 application, we've seen a number of bills in Congress focused on essentially chipping away at when 230 applies, creating these carve-outs from Section 230 that relate to a number of topics that, that we're trying to address in the online ecosystem. They're trying to create carve-outs for health misinformation, the sale of firearms, personalized algorithms that choose what content to show a user. And there's also a bill that seeks to take away 230 protection in those cases where a targeted ad was found to violate a user's civil rights. Now, I think these are all important topics, and on the surface, it definitely, these are issues we should be having conversations about. But when you see the topic that's being addressed and you see the bill that's trying to address this issue, from your perspective, do you think that these are actually having the outcome that they're aiming for? Is there an actual benefit for diverse consumer bases based on just what the legislation is actually trying to do?
Well, I think that's a really great question, and these are really important issues. But I think, for many of these, when we look at how they'll function in practice, we see that it all kind of leads back to the original reason why Section 230 was passed, which is this kind of uncomfortable situation where we know from First Amendment jurisprudence that you can't hold an intermediary strictly liable. You really can only do it if they have knowledge. And so without Section 230, we still have that First Amendment reality. And now we have this new disincentive for a provider to do anything that would potentially put them on notice, which is really what content moderation is about. I think good content moderation is providers being proactive and going and looking for things that, frankly, many of these bills are intended to address. But I think we have to be realistic and know that providers aren't going to be able to be perfect, particularly in the areas where there's a lot of nuance. And I think this is why we've seen, that companies prefer bright lines. They're not great unless, they have those bright lines. And so they're either going to overcorrect or just adopt really broad rules, or they may actually kind of throw up their hands and say, I don't know how to deal with this, so I'm not. Twitter decided, for example, not to run political ads, for the election. And I think that's a great example, similar to what companies did around FOSTA.
So why do you think Section 230 has been this sort of political football? Like, what is it about the law itself, the discourse? Just, you've been working on this for quite some time. You've seen how political parties have been using it to their advantage in their discourse. But why is 230 always popping up? Like, why is it the central theme in all these conversations?
I wish I knew, but I think it's really misunderstood. And I can understand why people, when they hear that there's this blanket immunity for these huge companies, just have very visceral reactions to that. But I think it really loses sight of, when we look at the cases that have been litigated, just, how broad the impact of Section 230 is and what it would mean for, consumers of services, users, individuals in their everyday life, organizations, if that protection wasn't there. And so, I can see why, from a political perspective, harnessing that emotional response to this idea of blanket immunity might be attractive. But I just think in terms of making sure we're doing things that benefit, individuals and make sure that the way people want to use online services, they can continue to do that. It's just really important to be very mindful of the realities of how Section 230 works.
No, it makes sense. I mean, it sounds like Section 230 could really benefit from a publicist to kind of help out with sort of some of this sort of the kind of misdirection out there. But, just again, you said something that I want to kind of come back to. You talked about bright lines. And, I think from my perspective, I think even our partner companies that work with us, I think they understand that there will be a regulatory framework that they need to play in. And, Section 230 has its role in that kind of framework. But, we are hearing from some folks, right, in political discourse, just talk about just getting rid of Section 230 altogether. And, I'm curious, again, like you've worked in this sort of area of jurisprudence for quite some time, to have it just all of a sudden shipped, like just chucked out the window. What would you say to those folks who are really passionately arguing to get rid of this law?
Well, I'm old, and so I remember the internet before user-generated content. Really, I think in the early days when Section 230 had just passed, there was very little case law. And there was a lot of caution about how users were able to express themselves. And, so much of the content that was available to people online was actually licensed content with, contracts and indemnity agreements kind of supporting it to make sure that the providers weren't too exposed. And I think, we look now at the way we use the internet, and, there's this entire thing called the creator economy that apparently is huge. And, things like that just can't exist in the same way in the absence of Section 230. So, I think this may repeat some of my earlier points, but I just want to emphasize that, Section 230 really is critical to give a platform to voices that are outside the mainstream or challenge the powers that be or aren't well funded enough to pay for placement. At the same time, it's also essential if you want to encourage providers to be more proactive in terms of removing content that is harmful. Right now, providers are getting hauled into court at alarming rates for taking things down, things like hate speech, incitement to violence, and misinformation. Section 230 protects the providers in those cases. And if that protection goes away, I think it's reasonable to think that content moderation is actually going to decrease.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I think, just as we start wrapping up our conversation, I think the central theme, of our kind of conversation today is that Section 230 has its place. And I do think we would all acknowledge that there are definitely concerns and issues in the online ecosystem that, are really impacting diverse communities. And while Section 230 is, hopefully we've kind of peeled back the layers a little bit to show that there is some nuance to understanding 230 and how tinkering with it or even trying to get rid of it may have, far worse consequences than the ones that we could imagine. But I don't, I want to leave our audience with, instead of sort of defending an idea and saying no to everything, I do want to leave our audience with some ideas of policy areas that they should be thinking about, policy areas in the tech space that they should be encouraging their policymakers to pursue. What are some of those topics that come to mind for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you referenced the popularity of Section 230 as in the political discourse, and honestly, changing Section 230 is not the solution to every problem. And so I think there are great examples where other things can be done that are going to be more useful. For example, ad targeting and discrimination. Likely better addressed through things like increased privacy protections, including consumer controls, required risk assessments, and more accountability for companies. So I think ideas like that are really promising and would have a lot of additional benefits beyond addressing that one issue. So it would be great to be able to get some momentum towards working on those sorts of things.
No, I think you're right. I think earlier I'd mentioned concerns about civil rights protections in the online space. And again, we've seen privacy legislation kind of move through Congress and now subsequently get stalled. But the conversations about how do you protect a user's data to ensure that it can't somehow be used against them in a way that would violate their civil rights. So I agree. I do think that, the call to privacy and comprehensive privacy legislation, I think, continues for sure as we head into this year. Well, that kind of wraps up our discussion. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this great conversation. And with that, I guess we'll turn it back over to the host to continue on these great conversations. Thanks all.
The internet continues to expand the reach of our voices, our culture, our stories, and our ingenuity. From abuelitas sharing their cooking secrets, hilarious memes, to dance challenges, to comedy made for us, by us. Over the course of our program today, we have been sharing a few examples of how multicultural creators are thriving by creating content that resonates with all of us. Here's a few more examples from one of my personal favorites at Maya in the Moment.
Si vienen a bailar, nos vamos a gozar. Si vienen a dormir, salgan fuera de aquí. Este es el ritmo de mi cumbia que te vas a mover. La cumbia que te traigo te daré placer para que muevas tu cuerpo de la cabeza a los pies. Y ahora que estamos de pie, se repitan todos después. Hey, hey, oh, oh, hey, hey, no me dejes.
Hi, I'm Latina, and I learned Spanish as an adult. I already know I offended a bunch of people. Hi, how are you doing? I could always understand it, but I was too afraid to speak it because people within our own community are pretty much like, what a disgrace you are to our culture. First of all, can we be more creative with our insults and the shame? Where's the creativity nowadays? It's dead. This is just a PSA for my people who feel the same way as me. Maybe you're still in the embarrassment stage where you haven't learned yet but want to. If you get people telling you these things like you're not enough, just know that it's a projection. It has nothing to do with you. Whether you want to learn or not is your choice and your business. And even if you do want to learn, please learn for yourself and not for the gatekeepers of the culture. Because I don't think they like themselves. I don't think they like anything. Also, wasn't the Spanish language forced upon us by... Hi, this is a message for you. So please listen up closely. Put the phone right up to your ear. Let it go. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Let it go. Stop dwelling on it. Stop replaying conversations in your head of the things you should have said and didn't say. Stop doing this in the shower, in the car, because it happened. It's done. It's over. Let it go. And it's making us really sad to freaking think about it all the time. It feels like a prison in our head. I don't want that. And we're probably blocking like another amazing, cool person or experience by keeping these thoughts in our head. So please let it go.
Hello, everyone. And on behalf of HTTP, I want to take a moment and say thank you to all of our speakers and partners who are making this event possible. Without you, we wouldn't be here today having this amazing time and opportunity. My name is Dr. Chris Wilkie, and I serve as the CEO of SHEP, the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers. SHEP is a nonprofit professional association that serves more than 13,000 Hispanics in STEM nationwide, and we're growing each year. Our main focus is to support Hispanic STEM students in completing their degrees and launching their careers in industry or academia. We know that a strong STEM identity is at the core of every successful STEM professional. And because the internet is both an avenue of information transfer, but in this case, more importantly, a platform for seeing diverse role models and promoting positive STEM identities, the importance of high-speed internet access cannot be overemphasized in its impact on fostering inclusivity in STEM. We highly value our partnership with HTTP and the prioritization of access to not only relevant technology, but also high-speed internet for all. I am so honored to be here with you and have the opportunity to introduce our last panel of the day, which will be moderated by Zaki Barzinji. He is a program director of Aspen Digital, and Zaki will be speaking with a group of Gen Z entrepreneurs and digital consultants on how tech helps and harms the Gen Z community. So with that, let's welcome Zaki and our panel.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the day that we're calling How Tech Helps and Harms Gen Z Communities. My name is Zaki Barzinji, and I'm a director at Aspen Digital, which is a program of the Aspen Institute that addresses the intersection of technology, policy, media, and society. My own work at Aspen Digital tends to focus on the intersection of tech and underrepresented communities. And it's in that spirit that we're very honored and excited to host this session as part of HTTP's Digital Inclusion Summit. Gen Z and tech, the topic so often talked about by policymakers, big companies, the media, concerned parents, and pearl clutchers everywhere. The questions are often the same. How do we protect kids online? How do we sell to kids? Will their future be brighter or darker? Why is TikTok evil? But also, how can I go viral on it? What's often missing from these conversations, of course, are the very people that are being talked about. Because the truth is, emerging technology is more than just a mixed bag for the rising generation. There are plenty of ways in which tech helps uplift and amplify young folks like never before, particularly those from communities that are traditionally marginalized. At the same time, there are also so many ways in which tech is actively harming the younger generations. And that harm is magnified 1,000 times more for those from marginalized communities. So to unpack these questions and highlight the lived experiences of those right at the center, Aspen Digital is partnering with Juve Consulting, which is one of the only entirely Gen Z run consulting firms today, to bring you this session. And I'm joined by 4 phenomenal young leaders with incredible backgrounds. I'll introduce all of them to you, and we will have a discussion. First up, Ziad Ahmed. Ziad is the founder and CEO of Juve Consulting. He's from Princeton, New Jersey, and is a recent graduate of Yale University, where he studied social media's impact on politics. In 2013, he founded Redefy, a nonprofit focused on creating resources to make schools more inclusive. Ziad has advised numerous organizations, politicians, and campaigns, served on nonprofit boards, and organized many different groups. He has given 4 TEDx talks, written for Teen Vogue, and spent too much time on TikTok. He was named to Forbes 30 under 30 at 19, and he has spoken everywhere from American Express to the Council on Foreign Relations to university dining halls. Gabe Garcia is the 23-year young senior director of People, Inclusion, and Accounts at Juve. They are a graduate of Northeastern University and hailing from Long Beach, California. They previously worked at Boston Consulting Group on the North America Diversity and Inclusion team, helping drive their inclusion, equity, and belonging agenda amongst staff. Prior, Gabe was a Millennium Fellow, where they worked with the United Nations in academic impact to advance LGBTQ+ health outcomes, promoting and centering queer wellness and inclusive care. In their free time, Gabe is a writer of mostly poetry and a washed-up dancer who occasionally can still do the splits, which we may or may not have time to ask them about. Claire Fennell. Claire is 19 years old and an English and creative writing major at New York University. Outside of her work at Juve, she's president of the NYU debate team and a literary event marketing intern at the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn. She's passionate about iced coffee, oldies music, the need for more women in stand-up, why we should all simp for the New York Times, and why Portland isn't actually all that woke. She's also passionate about queer media theory, and in her bio asks the question, did you know that vampires are often used to code for queer love in literature and movies? It's a good question. And finally, Faith Andrews O'Neill is director of The Live at Juve. She's 19 years old, born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, and a student at Columbia University. She's a staff writer for Columbia's newspaper, The Spectator, where she covers city news. She's been recognized for her work in journalism in both high school and college, and loves to use the methods learned in journalism to advocate for her community. As a dancer with Kansas City Friends of Alvin Ailey, she was featured on Netflix's Queer Eye and started a fine arts day camp for girls entering grades 5 to 9 in Kansas City. She's also an avid embroiderer. And that's our wonderful panel. Ziad, Gabe, Claire, Faith, thank you all so much for joining me for this conversation. Let's just get the elephant out of the room. I am indeed an ancient, creaky old millennial. And I feel like it was literally just yesterday that I was hearing all about how my generation was the me generation. We were the kids hopelessly lost in their phones and devices, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like I have both equal parts relief and sympathy for the fact that Gen Z has now moved under the microscope. And now everyone is trying to dissect and explain you as though you're wild lab experiments. So let me just start with like the most basic question. In one word, how does it feel to be a Gen Zer right now?
I would start by saying anxiety inducing. I think you nailed it on the head when you said there are a lot of people trying to like poke and prod and understand us. And that's kind of where Jude's ethos comes from, in a sense. Like, a lot of those people are not Gen Zers themselves. And so our fundamental and core belief here is, if you want to understand and reach young people, you actually have to talk to them and give them a seat at the table. And so I would say anxiety inducing, because, you know, we're still really pushing to get those seats at the table, or flip the table, as we also say here.
Yeah, kind of in a similar vein to Gabe, I think I would say overwhelming, kind of beyond just like the purely anxiety inducing, like there's so much going on in the world. There's also a huge sort of onus on Gen Z to do just 1,000,001 things all the time, both to like advocate for the causes that we're passionate about, like in our day-to-day lives, to, you know, enter the professional world as we're kind of in our like coming of age eras. And I think all of these sorts of pressures and expectations kind of get romanticized, right? Like, we're the generation that fights for change, but like that's also exhausting. So I think that there's just this like total culture of feeling overwhelmed that's within our generation, that I think kind of generates the anxiety that Gabe is talking about. And yeah, I think they're right on the nose.
Yeah, I think, speaking to Claire's point about the pressure, I think the first word that came to mind for me was informative. Like, I think we have so much access through social media and being like the digital generation to so much information. And it can be incredibly overwhelming at times, as we are constantly inundated with like every global and domestic and local crisis that is happening at any given time. But in that, I think also being in a position of privilege to be able to attend an institution such as Columbia, I'm also able to like use sort of all of that information and engage in discourse with my peers, and then go home and tell my grandma, like, that says abc.co, not .com, like, don't click on that website. That's not real news. So it's obviously overwhelming to be able to take in all that information, but also kind of having the opportunity to disseminate that information has been something that I think is really cool about Gen Z in particular.
My word is blender. It's not an adjective, it's a noun. And the reason it's blender is I often visualize myself as being in a blender without the cap on at full speed. And that's how I feel like what synthesizes the Gen Z experience in some ways, for me at least. It's this idea of constantly being whirled around. And I think there's a lot of whiplash in regards to trend and in regards to, you know, what we feel like we have permission to do or to say or to be. But also that there's sort of no ceiling, right? And on one hand, like, that's an enormous opportunity and like, is it deeply empowering? On the other hand, it's like a damn mess, right? And like quite literally means that like we're splashing everywhere constantly, sort of without any end in sight, right? And so I certainly resonate with this idea of us being this anxious, overwhelmed generation that is also using information as a source of power, right? But with any power comes risk, right? And I think that we are living, you know, and breathing that day in and day out.
Those are all excellent questions. And even more profound than I was hoping with such a simple prompt. So let's drill in a little bit. I mean, you all have all identified kind of this somewhat of a dichotomy binary, although, it's not really a binary, it's non-binary in terms of issues, which is that there's both the the opportunity that's presented more than ever especially by technology, and there's also more risks than ever before. Let's start with opportunity. I mean, what is making you most hopeful, most excited about both the present and the future when you think about technology in your generation? What are some big examples that make you hopeful and excited? And when it comes to especially, let's just say that I think all of you either come from or identify with communities that could be considered marginalized or at the margins in some way or another. Specifically for the communities that maybe you identify with or that you come from, what's making you hopeful about your generation and technology?
I think for me as a Black femme, and like I'm cis, and like just the existence of Black women, whether that is like Black trans women, Black femmes, Black cisgendered women, having the opportunity to kind of congregate very deliberately is something that I think throughout history has been like a strength of that community. But I think digitally, seeing Black women on the forefront of so many digital movements to kind of work against the algorithm that actively suppresses our voice has been something that's really inspiring for me to see, like knowing that despite the fact that like large media corporations don't necessarily want to see people that look like me on the forefront of their platforms, there are women and femmes doing the work every day to ensure that that's not the case. So from growing up in middle school and like the Blackout movement on Tumblr, which was just like every Black person posts a selfie today, and that was all that it was. And just being able to see just like Black faces throughout my feed in 6th grade, like scrolling on my school given iPad, to now seeing the same thing on TikTok when everyone, is changing their profile pictures to the Black Lives Matter fist. And we were told, like, especially on my feed, there was like one day and it was like on this day, like only like and engage with Black women's content just to see like what the algorithm will do. And then for like the next 2 days, which doesn't seem like a long time, but on TikTok is like 10 years, basically, my feed was just so flush with Black women and femmes and Black queer voices. And it was just very inspiring to see the ways in which we have been able to kind of adapt to modern times, whether that's like finding community in quarantine or dealing with like all these new social media platforms that are coming up every single day, and still finding ways to like buck against the norm and take up space and kind of find each other and find solace and like safety within each other's voices and presence, like regardless of where we are in America or in the world at large.
Love that. Claire?
Yeah, I think kind of speaking to a similar point of visibility. So for me, I identify as queer and non-binary. And I think that there are two really huge sort of changes that technology has allowed for that are super, super significant for these communities. And I think the first is the idea of visibility, but specifically because of invisibility as sort of a huge roadblock for the queer community historically, right? Like the whole sort of story of queer struggle, especially in the United States, but also globally, has been one of invisibility, right? Like laws that were designed to oppress us were made about alcohol so that they wouldn't actually know that they were oppressing queer people. Like little queer kids are like wondering if there are actually people that think and feel the way they think and feel, because maybe they're in like rural communities where they don't have that representation. Like me, I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in like a very sort of Christian and somewhat conservative environment. And the first time that I read a book that had like 2 girls kissing in it, I was like, wait, like that's allowed? Like sign me up, bro. But I think like social media and technology has obviously allowed us to see these things in a totally different light, where queer youth aren't sort of subject to that total sense of invisibility, right? Like they're able to find those communities online, even if they can't be out safely to their families. And I think that allows for like a huge sort of shift in the way that queer people discover their identities that makes me very hopeful. The kind of second dimension of that, dealing more with like the non-binary side of things, I think is that on like being online and existing in a virtual space has really transformed, I think, the conversation around pronouns, because I don't like walk down the street with a sign that says that I use she, they pronouns. And that means that like when people encounter me, they're going to rely on their base assumptions. And the shift in the digital landscape to including your pronouns like in your bios, to including your pronouns when you enter a space, has changed the way we think about those conversations when we run into people on the street. All of a sudden, it's, hey, you know, if I had this person's Instagram, I would see their pronouns, and maybe the questions are then being asked where when you meet someone, it's not based on your physical assumptions about them. It's based on, hey, I know this is now information to consciously look for. And I think that that shift couldn't have happened unless we started having these versions of ourselves that could carry around signs with those sorts of identifiers and like could carry with them on a very intrinsic level that sort of signification. So I think I feel really hopeful also for a sort of shift in the way we think about gender predicated by just that being a visible marker in the digital space. That also makes me super optimistic.
Awesome.
Yeah, I could certainly talk forever on this question, right? In regards to how I think social media has empowered and disempowered our generation, and empowered and disempowered me, right? Personally, in the communities that I identify with, right? I was, as Zaki might remember, right? This, you know, precocious, presumptuous, right, young American Muslim kid who got on the internet and got on stages and decided that my voice demanded to be heard, right? And I found a lot of empowerment and community through social media and through the digital sphere. And I built a nonprofit primarily through social media, right? And built a lot of my identity, myself, the people that the communities that I surrounded myself with through the digital sphere. And I used to believe with such an intensity that social media would make the world better, right? Like through expanding our horizons and through more of us connecting with more diverse stories and voices and, through the power of connection and information, the world would look better and brighter. And I used to dream of one day working on Twitter, right? And I really, really thought that social media was a force for good. I regret to inform, right, that sort of a decade later, having studied social media's impact on policy in college, having started a company now, oftentimes leaning into social media, having spent a lot more time in digital spaces, as they've evolved and as they diversified and as they've complicated, I no longer share that conviction, right? I'm not optimistic about the future of our digital spaces. And I say that understanding that it's complex, right? And it's not one or the other, right? It's not like social media didn't make the world better. It's that it also made the world worse in a lot of ways, right? It is both of these things at the same time. It is a double-edged sword. And on one hand, I look and I'm so proud, right? And grateful that through the power of social media, right, is really, Zaki, how you know who I am, right? Like, your colleague at the White House, right, who was Bangladeshi and American Muslim, saw my story about me that MTV News wrote and published on social media, and that went really viral within Muslim and Bangladeshi communities. And then I got on your radar, and you were gracious enough to host me at the White House on more than one occasion so that my voice as a young person could be included in high-level policymaking conversations around how my community and the communities that I care about are impacted, right, by policy and by politics and by government. And I'm grateful for that. However, right, I'm really concerned, right, about the fact that simultaneously social media propagated misinformation to the extent that it is, in my view, a principal cause of what is happening in Myanmar right now in terms of, right, the genocide that's happening against the Rohingya people in the Rakhine State, right? Insofar as the misinformation that's being spread about people on social media is actively inciting people to violence, right? And so we look at how our community has been simultaneously empowered and harmed. I don't know exactly where I net out, but I know that I net out in a way that isn't optimistic insofar as I think that when social media was first created, it did make the world better insofar as it expanded access to information. It expanded access to community. If you were the only person who looked like you, who loved like you, who prayed like you in your community, you could find someone thousands of miles away and build community and solidarity together. And that was a beautiful thing. right? But every day since then, the algorithms have gotten more perverse to prioritize advertiser over consumer, right? And to prioritize engagement clicks over discourse, right? That we are actually seeing us continually being empowered by new technologies, right? The advent of it made it work better. And we've seen basically like diminishing marginal returns since then, if that might make sense, right? And so I'm not optimistic insofar as I'm really concerned about how people are not using anonymized identity to empower and embolden the worst parts about society, right? About how polarized a lot of spaces and places are, such that there's no opportunity to even build empathy and compassion because we're operating from different facts because of how entrenched misinformation is in digital ecosystems and how hard it is to undo, right? And on one hand, I love seeing on my feed that Miss Marvel is coming out, and never did I think in my lifetime that I would see a hijabi Muslim congresswoman and a Palestinian congresswoman sitting, speaking their truth in Congress on my timeline. And never did I think I'd see a Muslim superhero from New Jersey who maybe looked like they could be my sister. And I am damn proud to see that. But simultaneously, we see the most heinous hate speech, right? And the most heinous misinformation that makes us more dangerous. And so I feel complicated and I'm trying to piece through it, but I'm not optimistic.
Yes, great. Thanks for taking us on that roller coaster with you. I think that's
sorry. It is a roller coaster,
and it's a good transition. I mean, that's obviously the next question is, what's the flip side of emerging technology and innovation? I mean, I think Gen Zers are known as being the first sort of like totally digital natives. They sometimes say that about millennials, but I don't really agree with that. So you all are meant to be the early adopters, the ones who understand intrinsically how technology works. But we've also seen the many harms that Ziad has already started outlining, especially when it comes again to different marginalized communities. How do you all feel about that? Well, what are the greatest threats that you're most worried about, whether it's your own communities or other communities that you've observed? What's out there on the threat horizon?
Yeah, I think I'm certainly worried about my community. I have a little bit more optimism than I think Ziad has in terms of social media and on connecting online, because I think it's not going anywhere, and so we have to find a way to be hopeful. I'm someone who deeply believes in that. But in terms of being worried for my community, I like Clara identify as non-binary and transgender, and what we've seen, right, is kind of like Ziad said, this double-edged sword. We're having a lot more visibility for trans women of color, and that's amazing. But with that visibility comes consequences, right? When people who hate that person see them being emboldened, they turn to the people in their community and harm a trans person who has absolutely nothing to do with Laverne Cox starring in Orange is the New Black, but they're so upset that this person is allowed to live in their full truth and they aren't, that they're then taking that violence out on their local communities and the trans community where they are. I think what makes me feel hopeful, even though obviously these horrible things are happening, I also know there's severe upticks in violence specifically towards Asian American women and Asian women. I think is the fact that for the first time in a long time, we're having really open conversations, not only in our personal lives, but also at work about these issues, about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I think as an emerging young professional in this field, there are a lot of companies that for the first time are saying oh crap, we need a diversity and inclusion department. We need to make sure that people can bring their full selves to work. And so I think the society is going to catch up. I think that it's going to take a little bit. But I think that, again, I'm cautiously optimistic because I see the young people I see right on this call, who bring me so much hope for that future, because I know that we're all fighting for the same thing.
Yeah, I kind of want to build on Gabe with this double-edged sort of visibility, because I think that it's something that really speaks to, especially the queer experience, but also the experience of any Gen Zer that is very behind a cause that, maybe shouldn't be political. A lot of these are very personal. I know we like to say the personal is political now, but that being said, I think the concern that I feel is it used to be that when you were queer, you would manage who knew that. And you had very much so total control over that visibility. There was one closet and you were in it or you were out of it. And now there are 400 closets in 50 different houses in 30 different states. And this feeling, I think, is really challenging because it leaves queer people to do this exhausting calculus all the time where, I'm out at work. I use my preferred pronouns at work, but I'm not out to my family who does have access to the internet and could find my bio for the company. And I think this sort of calculus and the sort of consequences of this visibility mean that even as Gen Zers get to live more authentic truths and get to be their full selves in a way that is broadly more accepting, they're also putting themselves at a huge risk. And I don't think that the digital community has solved this yet. Like, I think you should be able to have your pronouns display differently for different groups of people on social media platforms. I think that this sort of there should be more control over your ability to express yourself safely online. And you should have the same amount of control that you have. I think something that's really challenging about online is where you can code switch in real life. You have one online persona, and managing that in a way that feels authentic to yourself without putting yourself in danger is a huge challenge that I think is really aching for someone to solve. I don't know that anyone has figured out how to fix that yet, but I know it's something that really worries me for people that are expressing their political opinions, expressing their identities in a way that might not be palatable to employers, might not be palatable to their families. And how do we let people use those platforms while keeping them safe? I don't really know. I'm hopeful someone will figure it out, but that's where my concern lies.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Saki, if I cut you off.
No, it's Nicole and you, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I think just to shift slightly, I think a major problem that I've seen, and I was speaking with my friend who was doing her sociology project about queerness and TikTok, and we kind of found ourselves in a discussion about the commodification of marginalized cultures on these platforms. And that has been such a major issue for me as a Black woman, a Black queer woman who in many ways exists at the forefront of so many different cultures as far as our creation and contribution to those cultures, to then see them taken to a platform and minimalized and turned into trends, and then trying to engage in conversations about those trends and stating you need to credit dance creators, you need to look at the slang that you're using and recognize that it comes from Black trans women or just African-American vernacular English, and having those conversations and seeing people say, no, that's TikTok slang. That's Twitter slang. No, this is just a TikTok trend. It's okay that I'm posting a video of me dancing to a Lauryn Hill song with a tattoo on my arm of Lauryn Hill on my white body, because we're all online and we're all engaging in culture. And the beautiful parts about being on social media is this dissemination of culture. And to an extent, I think that is the truth. However, understanding the differences between cultural exchange and cultural appropriation lie almost entirely in respect for these cultural significance and understanding the long temporality of all these things, and knowing that TikTok is not the beginning and end of Black culture or queer culture, or what it means to be a trans person, a non-binary person in this country. It is the current dot on a very, very long timeline. And that has been kind of the largest issue for me, is seeing the ways in which the ways that I have partaken in culture throughout my life and been mocked or demeaned for that participation. And then seeing people being celebrated on these platforms while also simultaneously not acknowledging the roots of these things, or seeing the ways in which, especially white cis men can kind of take aspects of queer aesthetic and wear them and profit from them, and then turn around and kind of offhandedly say that they were inspired by Marsha P. Johnson, and not really receive any pushback against that, because now in a way TikTok is seen as a sort of cultural bastion, when in reality it did not, none of this is new, and none of these dances are even new. They come from Triller and predominantly Black platforms, and people on the ground dancing and finding community and comfort within each other and creating culture because of that, as opposed to kind of creation for an app, which is what it has been today. And I think in a way, a lot of young people, especially people that are younger than me, 14, 15-year-olds coming into contact with this content, or my sister that's 11, are kind of remiss in not understanding kind of the background and history of the content and the cultures that they're engaging with on the platform. And that does make me a little bit worried for if this is where we are now, what will this look like in 10 years from now? How minimalized will these cultural practices be?
Yeah. So we have a little bit of time left, and this is a fascinating conversation. I wanted to maybe close with maybe a slightly more practical question, which is, we're here, this whole Inclusion Summit is, focused on driving change, especially, I think, when it comes to the tech industry, when it comes to policymaking and things like that. I know that all of you do work with tech industry, with media companies, and, you are called upon regularly and perhaps sometimes exploited for your perspective on your generation. I guess my question is, what is sort of the number one thing that you think, let's say the tech industry specifically, needs to do or change when it comes to engagement or the centering of Gen Zers? The one thing that the tech industry needs to do. Yeah, go ahead, Ziad.
So I'm not concise, so I apologize in advance. But one thing I would say is it's not one thing, right? Like it's not one thing, because this is such a complex problem that affects so many marginalized and vulnerable communities, right? And I think both government and the tech community, and I think individuals on these platforms all have a role to play in hopefully building a better digital ecosystem for all of us, right? And I think that what I would say is that I think it starts with, but if you're wanting to center diverse young voices on the platform, like listen to them as in decision makers, right? Like we should have vice presidents who look like the communities that are trying to be served in real time at these companies if we want to serve these communities, right? And that's like why Juke Consulting exists and why we do the work that we do. But I think beyond that, from a more functional, landscape, like the biggest problem that I have with the tech industry with Silicon Valley right now is the conflation of innovation and progress. But it's this idea that just because something is new and interesting, that means that it makes the world better. Right? And I think it gets us into a lot of traps. It means that the technology that we're building does not actually serve us because of a presumption that it will inherently serve us, right? And so right now we are in a critical moment, right? Where tech companies are making a big pivot towards Web3, right? And on one hand, Web3 presents wonderful opportunities of attribution, right? To Faith's point around the fact that so much of culture has been co-opted, has been stolen, has been exploited. Through blockchain technology and through attribution, we can perhaps protect that more so. The people can own the trend that they created and profit off of that in perpetuity as they should, right? For being the cultural originator of something digitally, right? On the other hand, Web3 creates a lot of really perverse realities of the winners of Web3 and cryptocurrency are already pre-decided by those who had the liquid capital, right? And the risk appetite to already invest at a very early time, which entrenches systemic inequality because it wasn't marginalized communities who invested, right? It wasn't those, right, who couldn't afford to take that risk who invested, right? And so that has inherently already created an imbalance in who is creating these technologies because it's not looking like the communities who need to be served, right? And those who are profiting off of it are not looking like the communities who need to be served, right? And then on top of that, when we think about the metaverse, when we think about these technologies, they allow for even more perverse forms of anonymized identity, right? Where you can cosplay and costumize as whatever you want to be. And we are just now getting to a point in society where I can show up here as an American Muslim and all of us can show up here as our full selves, right? With whatever identities we might share and claim our stories, our identities, our baggage with pride, only to create digital humans and digital stories that are completely fabricated when we're not still listening to the real people who matter. Like, I don't need, in my view, a digital avatar to tell me about their trauma when we still have real people that we're not listening to when it comes to their trauma, right? And I don't need an infinite Times Square where people can market to me in a digital landscape when I'm already trying to get limits on my phone so I'm on it less. So are we creating technologies that people actually want? And are the people creating them the people that we're actually trying to serve? Right? And I think we're in a critical moment where we ought to be asking that question by having voices like these in the room, right? By empowering them and by willing to take risks, right? That might not always be good for business, but there's a lot bigger things at stake than business. When we look at the mental health crisis that's happening among young people in this world, when we look at climate change, like I think the air that we breathe, right? And the hearts that we have matter a lot more to me than whether a business thrives. And we ought to be having that conversation in real time. I don't think those in Silicon Valley are.
Yeah, I think I kind of want to expand on something Ziad said and then also a little bit disagree with part of it. I think so. I am now an English major, but I used to be a statistics major. So I'm going to try to speak to that, and it might be a little imperfect. But there is a phenomenal book called Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. And what this book talks about is the idea of algorithms and how they're harmful to marginalized communities. One of the really big examples that she draws upon is broken windows policing, and the idea that our current police algorithms are based on patterns of police data that were created when police officers who had their personal biases were creating the data sets that would later be used to inform so-called like objective algorithms. And I think that although the impact of that is a little bit more straightforward and we can understand why that would be racist and harmful, I don't think that we're applying those same lenses to the algorithms that govern our social media platforms. I think that there's this misconception that when we automate things and make them more objective on paper, that means they're actually more objective and actually serve all communities equally. But the reality is, if the data is made by people with biases, then the algorithms themselves are going to be biased. So I think bringing humans back into the process, not over automating, not saying, hey, it's an algorithm, so it has to be more objective, is the only thing we can do to fight back against the idea that the data sets we have are informed by systemic injustice that defines our world. And I think that when we start to evaluate that, when we start to put like human beings back in the decision-making process, and specifically human beings who are representative of the communities we're trying to work for back into the process of evaluating what content we center, that's how we sort of fight back. So I think if there's one thing that tech companies can do, it's understand that like making it objective, making it math doesn't mean it's not racist, doesn't mean it's not homophobic, doesn't mean it's not sexist. In fact, it could be worse because all of a sudden we're just calling those things numbers and we don't have the association that we have with those words that gives us sort of the impetus to actually fight back against those issues.
Thanks, Claire.
Clear. I could not agree more.
Excellent. Faith or Gabe, would one of you like to take us out?
Yeah, I sure can. I think, right, what one thing, there's a lot of things that tech companies should do. I'm sure we've all seen The Social Dilemma, right? Like we know how tech companies work. We know that, they have so much data and information on us. And I think that there are a few different things they could do. One interesting idea that's been posed, I think, by a lot of different folks at this point is giving us ownership of the information that companies have on us. I think that like we look at information as an asset, but not an asset online, if that makes sense. We have never had access to own our information online. And so I think if we really want, if a company wants to know about me, like I'm totally willing to sell you my information, but there has to be some sort of more exchange than clicking accept all cookies, right? When I go on a website. I also think, right, social media knows that it's bad for people. Literally, Instagram has internal reports saying that, Instagram is bad for teenage girls because it promotes anxiety, body image issues, all these other issues, because at the end of the day, like social media is performance. And I think that, obviously it's a great connector and tech companies have given us so much in terms of ways for us to, like Ziad said, right, connect with people all around the world. But at the end of the day, like what they need to do is I think specifically protect kids and our communities. We talked right in the session about shadow banning and that sort of thing. And I think like we need stronger kind of protection around, kids and the way that their information is sold and stored online. And also, like Claire talked about, I think there needs to be a really good look at, what algorithms are kind of leading the charge and try and avoid this boiling people and all their complexity and diversity down to a set of numbers or data.
Thank you so much. Faith, actually, any final thoughts on your end too? I want to make sure everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has really done a good job of covering so many different viewpoints. I think the largest thing is just finding better ways of like kind of uniformly attributing content to the people that it came from. I think there is an issue with so much of just like I spoke about, like the commodification of culture, but on like a very small level, like on TikTok, there are so many opportunities for like young Black creatives to have much larger platforms than they have. And you just see so many people talking about like not getting an artist tag on the songs that they've released, or like dance trends that go so viral that like Charli D'Amelio was invited to go on Jimmy Fallon and do a dance that was created by like a 12-year-old Black girl, and having to like push and push and push to have her like recognized for something that brought like so many people to that platform. I think is something that I just would like to see more of, just seeing like the people that are kind of acting as the foundation for so much content on this platform being like formally recognized and having like a through process for having the opportunity to like profit from and like live off of their creativity, which is something so often only afforded to certain demographics of people.
Thank you so much, Faith. Well, Ziad, Gabe, Claire, Faith, thank you all so much for this conversation. This is honestly such an important conversation. And, if there's one thing we could take away, it's that the communities that decisions are being made about should be included in every conversation that's about them, whether it's tech companies, whether it's policymakers, whether it's, all the elite institutions like the Aspen Institute. We need to all be taking better steps to including, these perspectives and these voices. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you to HTTP.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, HTTP, for having us. We hope you all enjoyed this session and the rest of the summit, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Wow, what a day. It has been such an honor to be here with you today and to have these important and necessary conversations. Thank you so much for joining us in these discussions about accountability, as well as what strategies are working in communities, from the historical obstacles of facing accessing reliable internet and getting those digital tools to the language we use around discussing broadband and internet access. I'm so honored to be a part and support these conversations. We have learned so much and also discovered how far we need to go to form a more equitable and digital world for all of us. Thank you again for tuning in. I want to send my appreciation to the community advocates, our policymakers and elected officials, and all our speakers for giving their time today. A very special thank you to our HTTP Latino Influencers live team who have been live tweeting and live Instagramming today's event. Thank you to our HTTP CEO Roundtable members, and especially this year's underwriting partners. To learn more about our work at HTTP, please visit www.httppolicy.org. And as always, make sure to connect with us on social media by following at HTTP_policy. See you next time.